This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was driving through the Ozarks with my 8-year-old daughter Lily on what was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just the two of us, escaping the city for some mother-daughter bonding time in nature. I'm a single mom and don't get as much quality time with Lily as I'd like, so I was really looking forward to this trip. We left St. Louis early that morning, planning to reach our cabin rental by early afternoon. The drive started off great. Lily was in high spirits, singing along to the radio and pointing out interesting sights as we wound through the beautiful autumn landscape. The fall colors were spectacular, with the trees ablaze in vibrant reds, oranges, and golds. About 3 hours in, we turned off the main highway onto smaller country roads. I thought I knew where I was going based on the directions I'd printed out, but the cell service was spotty and my GPS kept cutting out. The roads got narrower and more winding as we went deeper into the heavily forested hills. After a while, I started to get an uneasy feeling that we'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. The road had deteriorated into little more than a dirt track, rutted and overgrown. I hadn't seen another car or building for at least an hour. Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat, oblivious to my growing anxiety. I was about to turn around and try to retrace our steps when I came around a bend and saw a clearing up ahead with some structures. Relieved, I pulled up, hoping to find someone who could give us directions. As I got closer, though, my unease returned. The place had an eerie, abandoned feel to it. There were a handful of dilapidated wooden buildings arranged in a rough circle. They looked like old cabins or shacks, weathered and falling apart. In the center was a larger structure that resembled a barn or meeting hall. The whole compound was surrounded by dense forest on all sides. I stopped the car at the edge of the clearing, debating whether to proceed or turn back. That's when I noticed movement near one of the buildings. A figure emerged, wearing what looked like a long, dark robe or cloak with a hood obscuring their face. They stood motionless, seeming to stare in our direction. A chill ran down my spine. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but before I could put the car in reverse, more robed figures began appearing from the other buildings. Within moments, there were at least a dozen of them, forming a loose semicircle and slowly advancing towards us. Panic rising, I tried to back up, but the engine sputtered and died. I turned the key frantically, but it wouldn't start. The figures were getting closer. I shook Lily awake, trying to keep the fear out of my voice as I told her to stay in the car and lock the doors. Heart pounding, I got out to confront them, hoping I could somehow talk our way out of this. But as they got closer, the words died in my throat. Their robes were adorned with strange symbols I didn't recognize, and although their faces were shadowed by their hoods, I could see that many were wearing grotesque masks underneath, leering, inhuman faces that sent a jolt of primal terror through me. They began chanting in a language I didn't understand, the sound low and guttural. I backed up against the car, feeling utterly helpless. I could hear Lily crying inside, and it broke my heart that I couldn't protect her from whatever was about to happen. Just as the circle was about to close in on us, a piercing shriek cut through the air. It sounded almost like a bird call, but too loud, too alien. The robed figures froze, then began looking around in agitation. The shriek came again, closer this time, and they started to back away. A voice spoke directly into my mind. "Run, now, follow my call." I didn't stop to question it. I yanked open the car door, scooped up Lily, and took off running towards the trees in the direction the sound had come from. I could hear shouts and commotion behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We plunged into the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. I had no idea where we were going, but that unearthly shriek sounded again, guiding us onward. My lungs were burning and Lily was sobbing in terror, but somehow I found the strength to keep going. After what felt like an eternity of running, we burst out onto a paved road. A battered pickup truck was idling there, driver's side door open. That voice spoke in my head again. "Get in, drive. Don't stop until you reach the highway." Too shocked and scared to do anything but obey, I loaded Lily into the truck and peeled out onto the road. We drove for nearly an hour before hitting the highway, the whole time expecting pursuit, but nothing followed us. We made it back to St. Louis that night, shaken to our core. I've never been able to explain what happened that day. I tried reporting it to the police, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. I've scoured maps of the area, but can't find any trace of that compound. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I look at Lily and see the lingering trauma in her eyes. I don't know who or what saved us that day. Guardian angel? Alien? Some kind of forest spirit? I'll probably never know, but I thank whatever it was every single day for delivering us from that nightmare. We've never returned to the Ozarks, and I don't think we ever will. Some places are best left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved. I just hope whatever is out there in those hills stays there and doesn't find its way to the wider world. The experience changed me profoundly. I find myself jumping at shadows, always looking over my shoulder. I've developed an aversion to the woods that I can't seem to shake. Lily still has nightmares sometimes, though she says she can't remember exactly what happened. Maybe that's for the best. I've tried to move on with our lives, to pretend it never happened. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I sometimes hear that otherworldly shriek echoing in my mind. And I wonder, was it really trying to help us? Or was it luring us deeper into something we can't even begin to comprehend? I don't have any answers, only questions that haunt me. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces of darkness and light locked in an eternal struggle. And sometimes, ordinary people like us get caught in the middle. I still don't know why we were spared that day. Was it random chance, divine intervention, or are we part of some larger plan that's yet to unfold? I may never know the truth, but I do know this. I'll never take my safety, or my daughter's, for granted again. Because now I've seen firsthand how quickly everything you know can be turned upside down, how thin the veil is between our mundane world and whatever lies beyond. So I hold Lily a little tighter now, cherish every moment we have together. And I pray that whatever saved us that day is still out there, still watching over us. Because I have a feeling our brush with the unknown isn't over. That somehow, someday, those dark forces will come looking for us again. And next time, we might not be so lucky. For now, though, we go on with our lives as best we can. But a part of me will always be back in those shadowy woods, running for our lives from robed figures and unknown terrors. The experience is seared into my soul, a constant reminder of how fragile our sense of security really is. I've thought about moving, starting over somewhere new, but deep down I know it wouldn't matter. You can't outrun the darkness once it touches you. All you can do is stay vigilant, hold your loved ones close, and hope that when the time comes, you'll find the strength to face whatever emerges from the shadows. So that's my story. I don't expect anyone to believe it. Hell, most days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I know that out there in the vastness of the Ozarks, something is waiting, watching, biding its time. To anyone reading this who might be planning a trip to that area, be careful. Stay on the main roads. Don't go exploring off the beaten path. And if you hear an unearthly shriek echoing through the trees, run. Run and don't look back, because you never know what might be calling to you from the darkness. It was a muggy afternoon when I set out to interview some locals about the strange occurrences in the swamp. The air was thick and heavy, clinging to my skin as I drove down the winding back roads. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like ghostly curtains, swaying gently in the breeze. My rental car rattled along the uneven pavement as I peered through the windshield, searching for the turnoff to the small fishing village I was supposed to visit. The GPS on my phone had lost signal miles back, so I was relying on the vague directions the gas station attendant had given me earlier. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I muttered, coasting to a stop on the shoulder. I turned the key, but the engine wouldn't catch. Great, just great. I stepped out of the car, immediately hit by a wall of humid air and the drone of insects. The road stretched out empty in both directions, bordered by dense swampland. I popped the hood and stared helplessly at the engine, realizing I had no idea what I was looking at. Mechanics was never my strong suit. With a sigh, I pulled out my cell phone. No service, of course. I was on my own out here. I weighed my options. I could wait by the car and hope another vehicle came along, but traffic seemed pretty sparse on this road. Or I could start walking and try to find help. Neither option was particularly appealing. After a few minutes of indecision, I grabbed my backpack from the car and started trudging down the road. The sun was getting low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. I figured I'd walk for an hour or so, and if I didn't come across any signs of civilization, I'd turn back. As I walked, the swamp seemed to press in closer on both sides. The croaking of frogs and chirping of insects grew louder, creating an eerie chorus. Every so often, I'd hear a splash from the murky water beyond the tree line that made me jump. About 45 minutes into my trek, I spotted something through the trees. The dilapidated remains of an old wooden dock jutting out into the swamp. Maybe there was a house nearby? I veered off the road, pushing through the underbrush toward the water's edge. The rickety dock creaked ominously under my feet as I ventured out over the dark water. Patches of algae floated on the surface, and I could see shapes moving beneath, probably fish or turtles. I cupped my hands around my mouth and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Only the echoes of my own voice answered me. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the swamp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. That didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. I scanned the murky water, heart pounding. The growl came again, closer this time. Something large was moving through the water toward the dock, creating ripples on the surface. Panic seized me. I spun around to run back to shore, but my foot caught on a loose board. I went down hard, cracking my chin on the weathered wood. Before I could scramble to my feet, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed as I was yanked toward the edge of the dock. My fingers scrabbled desperately for purchase on the slimy boards. Whatever had me was incredibly strong, dragging me inexorably toward the water. I managed to flip onto my back, kicking frantically with my free leg. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of my attacker, a pale, elongated arm ending in webbed claws. Then I was pulled off the dock and into the swamp with a huge splash. The murky water closed over my head. I thrashed wildly, trying to break free of the iron grip on my ankle. My lungs burned for air. Just as my vision started to go dark, I felt the creature release me. I kicked to the surface, gasping and choking. As I treaded water, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a huge, serpentine shape gliding beneath the surface. I swam for shore as fast as I could, expecting at any moment to feel those claws grabbing me again. I hauled myself out of the water, stumbling and falling on the muddy bank. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly into the woods, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs felt like they were on fire, and my soaked clothes weighed me down. Finally, I burst out of the tree line onto the road. I bent over, hands on my knees, as I tried to catch my breath. When I looked up, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, praying the driver would stop. To my immense relief, the beat-up pickup truck slowed to a halt beside me. An older man with a weathered face peered out the window at me. "You all right, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." I babbled out an incoherent explanation about my car breaking down and something attacking me in the swamp. The man's expression grew grave. He opened the passenger door. "Get in. It ain't safe out here after dark." I gratefully climbed into the truck. As we drove, the man, who introduced himself as Earl, explained that I wasn't the first person to have a run-in with the swamp devil, as the locals called it. "Been taking folks for years," Earl said. "Fish and Wildlife says it's just gators, but we know better. That thing ain't natural." He drove me to a small cluster of houses, where I was able to use a phone to call for a tow truck. The locals were kind, offering me dry clothes and hot coffee while I waited. But I could sense their unease. They kept glancing out the windows nervously as night fell. When the tow truck finally arrived, Earl and a couple other men insisted on following me back to my car to make sure I got out of there safely. As we drove down that lonely stretch of road, I kept imagining shapes moving in the darkness beyond the headlights. Back in my hotel room that night, I sat on the edge of the bed, still shaken. My clothes from earlier lay in a heap on the floor, caked in drying mud. I stared at the scratches on my ankle where that thing had grabbed me. I came here chasing a story about missing persons in the swamp. Now I had my own terrifying encounter to add to the growing list of inexplicable incidents. But who would believe me? I could hardly believe it myself. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I kept replaying the attack in my mind. The inhuman strength of the creature, the fleeting glimpse I'd caught of its pale, elongated limb. What was that thing? Some kind of undiscovered species? A mutation? Or something else entirely? I tossed and turned, startling at every little noise. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark water closing over my head, felt those claws wrapping around my ankle. I knew the nightmares would plague me for a long time to come. In the morning, I checked out of the hotel and hit the road, eager to put as much distance between myself and that swamp as possible. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordeal wasn't over, that somehow, some way, the swamp devil would find me again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pale, inhuman face staring back at me. There was nothing there, of course, just the lonely stretch of highway behind me. But the unease lingered. What I experienced in that Louisiana swamp defied explanation. I know what I saw, what I felt. That creature was real, and it's still out there in those murky waters, waiting, watching, hungry. I filed my story about the disappearances, being careful to stick to the official accounts and leave out my own terrifying encounter. Who would believe me anyway? But I know the truth, and I'll never look at a swamp the same way again. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, phantom sensations of claws on my ankle. In my dreams, I'm back in that dark water, being dragged down into the depths by something ancient and hungry, something that should not exist in our world. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully explain or understand what happened to me that day. But I know one thing for certain. There are things lurking in the shadows of this world that defy our understanding. Primal, terrifying things. And sometimes they reach out and drag the unsuspecting into their domain. So if you ever find yourself on a lonely road through the bayou, my advice is this: keep driving. Don't stop. And whatever you do, stay out of the water. You never know what might be waiting just beneath the surface, ready to pull you down into the murky unknown. Late one night, we were cruising down a lonely stretch of highway somewhere in West Texas. I was half asleep in my bunk when I felt the bus lurch and heard a loud pop. We swerved onto the shoulder as the engine sputtered and died. Our driver, Matt, climbed out to take a look. A few minutes later, he poked his head back in with a grim expression. "Busted fuel pump," he announced. "We ain't going anywhere tonight." We all groaned. We had a show scheduled for the next evening and couldn't afford to miss it. Matt said there was a small town about a mile up the road. Maybe we could find a mechanic there in the morning. With no other options, we grabbed flashlights and started walking. The night was eerily quiet except for the sound of gravel crunching under our feet. A chilly breeze made me shiver. As we approached the town, I felt a growing sense of unease. There were no lights visible anywhere, not a single porch light or street lamp. The buildings loomed as dark silhouettes against the starry sky. "Hello?" Matt called out as we reached the first houses. No response. We made our way down what seemed to be the main street. Abandoned cars sat rusting along the curb. Storefronts were boarded up, their windows dark and empty. An old movie theater marquee was missing most of its letters. "What the hell happened here?" our bassist Jake whispered. "It's like the whole town just up and left." "Let's find somewhere to crash for the night," I suggested. "We can figure things out in the morning." We chose an old motel at the edge of town. The door to the office hung off its hinges. Inside, a thick layer of dust covered everything. Jake found some room keys behind the front desk, and we each took one. My room was musty and damp. The bedspread was moth-eaten, and the bathroom mirror was cracked. But I was too exhausted to care. I collapsed onto the bed and fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start several hours later. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back. The bus breaking down, the abandoned town. A glance at my watch showed it was just past 3 a.m. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed a faint glow coming from outside. Curious, I went to the window and peered out. In the distance, I could see lights moving in the old industrial area on the outskirts of town. It looked like flashlight beams sweeping back and forth. My heart began to race. Who else was out there? And why were they creeping around an abandoned factory in the middle of the night? Part of me said to stay put and wait for morning, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was going on. I threw on my shoes and jacket and slipped out of the room. The night air was frigid as I made my way through the silent streets toward the factory. As I got closer, I could hear faint voices and see multiple beams of light moving inside the building. I crouched behind an old dumpster, trying to get a better view through the broken windows. Suddenly, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind. I tried to scream but couldn't make a sound. Strong arms wrapped around me, pinning my arms to my sides. I thrashed and kicked, but it was no use. "We got another one," a gruff voice said. "Bring him inside." I was dragged through a rusted side door into the factory. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. My captors marched me down a long hallway, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. We emerged into a large open area filled with old conveyor belts and machinery. To my horror, I saw several other people tied up and huddled on the floor. Some were crying while others sat in stunned silence. "Please," I begged as they shoved me to the ground. "What do you want from us?" A tall man in a black coat stepped forward. In the dim light I could see he was wearing some kind of mask that obscured his features. "You shouldn't have come here," he said in a cold, emotionless voice. "This town doesn't belong to your kind anymore." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We just broke down nearby. We didn't mean to intrude." The man tilted his head, studying me. "It doesn't matter. You've seen too much. We can't let you leave." With that, he turned and walked away. Two burly men in similar dark clothes began tying up my wrists and ankles. My mind was reeling. What the hell was going on here? Who were these people? And what did they mean about the town not belonging to our kind anymore? I looked around at the other captives. There was an older couple, a young woman who looked to be in her 20s, and a middle-aged man in a business suit. None of them seemed to know each other or why we were being held. Hours passed. Occasionally one of the masked figures would come check on us, but they ignored our questions and pleas. I was cold, hungry, and terrified. As dawn approached, I heard engines revving outside. Through the grimy windows, I could see several black vans pulling up to the factory. The masked leaders conferred in hushed tones. Then they began loading the other prisoners into the vans. My heart pounded as I realized I might be running out of time. In desperation, I started working at the ropes binding my wrists. To my surprise, I felt them begin to loosen. Just as two of the men approached to grab me, I managed to slip free. I kicked one in the knee and shoved the other aside, then sprinted for the exit. Shouts echoed behind me as I burst out of the factory. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I made it to the edge of town before I dared to look back. There was no sign of pursuit. I kept moving, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that nightmarish place. After what felt like hours, I reached the highway. My legs were ready to give out. I stuck out my thumb, praying someone would stop. To my immense relief, an old pickup truck pulled over. The elderly driver gave me a concerned look. "You all right, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." I climbed in, still trembling. "Please, just get me out of here," I said. As we drove away, I kept glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see black vans in pursuit. But there was nothing but empty road behind us. I never saw my bandmates again. The police found our abandoned tour bus, but there was no trace of the others. The town appeared completely deserted when investigators arrived. No sign of the factory, the captives, or the masked figures. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened in that ghost town. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just a vivid nightmare. But then I look at the rope burns on my wrists and know it was real. I don't tour anymore. I can't bring myself to get back on the road. But late at night, I still hear that cold voice echoing in my head. This town doesn't belong to your kind anymore. And I wonder what dark forces are really out there, hiding in the shadows of forgotten places. I was on a road trip through the South, sampling local cuisine and writing reviews for my blog. After a long day of driving, I decided to stop at the next restaurant I saw, no matter how it looked. That's how I ended up pulling into the gravel parking lot of Mama's Home Cookin', just as the sun was setting. From the outside, it didn't look like much, just a weathered wooden building with a rusty metal roof and a flickering neon open sign in the window. But I was starving and figured even mediocre diner food would hit the spot. Little did I know what I was walking into. As soon as I stepped through the door, an uneasy feeling washed over me. The interior was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. A haze of cigarette smoke hung in the air, even though indoor smoking had been banned in Georgia years ago. The few other patrons, all men in dirty work clothes, fell silent and turned to stare at me as I entered. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly wanting nothing more than to turn around and leave. But before I could, a booming voice called out from behind the counter. "Well, don't just stand there, sugar. Come on in and have a seat. We don't bite much." The speaker was an enormous woman with greasy gray hair piled atop her head. She let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a hacking cough. Not wanting to seem rude, I forced a smile and made my way to an empty booth in the corner, hyper-aware of the eyes following my every move. As I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, I noticed dark stains on the tabletop that I prayed were just spilled coffee. The waitress, a rail-thin woman with hollow eyes, shuffled over and tossed a sticky laminated menu in front of me without a word. I scanned it quickly, looking for the safest option. Everything seemed to involve some sort of mystery meat or Mama's special sauce. "I'll just have a burger and fries, please," I said, figuring that was hard to mess up too badly. The waitress nodded and shuffled away without writing anything down. As I waited for my food, I tried to distract myself by observing the decor, if you could call it that. The walls were covered in a hodgepodge of faded photos, old license plates, and what looked disturbingly like animal bones arranged in strange patterns. A stuffed boar's head was mounted above the register, its glass eyes seeming to follow me. The longer I sat there, the more my skin crawled. The air felt thick and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. Strange whispers and giggles kept catching my ear, but whenever I looked around, no one was talking. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned and slid a plate in front of me. The burger looked off somehow. The meat was an odd grayish color, and the bun had an oily sheen. The fries were limp and greasy. "Enjoy," the waitress muttered before hurrying away. I stared at the food, my stomach churning. Everything in me was screaming not to eat it, but I could feel the other customers watching me expectantly. With trembling hands, I picked up the burger and forced myself to take a small bite. The taste was indescribable, rancid and chemical and just wrong. I immediately wanted to spit it out, but I was afraid of offending whoever had cooked this monstrosity. So I choked it down and took a long swig of water to wash away the taste. As soon as I swallowed, a wave of dizziness swept over me. The room started to spin and tilt crazily. My limbs felt heavy and uncoordinated. Panic rose in my throat as I realized something was very, very wrong. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I opened my mouth to call for help, but no sound came out. Through blurry vision, I saw the other customers rise from their seats and start to approach my table with sinister grins. Just as I was about to pass out, the door burst open with a bang. A group of people rushed in, shouting something I couldn't make out. Strong hands grabbed me and hauled me to my feet. I was vaguely aware of being half carried, half dragged out of the diner and shoved into a car. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the diner owner and customers standing in the doorway, watching us drive away with furious expressions. Then everything faded to black. I woke up hours later in a motel room, surrounded by concerned faces. As my head cleared, they explained that they were locals who had been trying to shut down that diner for years. Travelers had been disappearing after eating there, but the police never found any evidence of wrongdoing. When they saw me go in, they knew they had to act fast. They followed me and intervened when they realized I'd been drugged. If they hadn't shown up when they did, I shudder to think what might have happened to me. I filed a police report, but just like all the other times, a search of the diner turned up nothing suspicious. By the time I was able to return a few days later, the whole building had been burned to the ground in a tragic accident. To this day, I have no idea what was really going on in that place or what they put in my food. All I know is that I'm incredibly lucky to have escaped. I've given up reviewing restaurants and stick to home cooking these days. Some experiences you just can't shake, no matter how much time passes. I still have nightmares about those hungry eyes watching me from the shadows as I took that first bite of that cursed burger. So if you're ever driving through rural Georgia and see a rundown diner called Mama's Home Cookin', keep driving. No meal is worth risking your life over, and always trust your instincts if a place gives you a bad feeling. You never know what horrors might be lurking behind a greasy menu and a fake smile. Was hiking alone in the Appalachian Mountains, enjoying the solitude and crisp autumn air. As a retired soldier, I relished these peaceful moments in nature after years of chaos and conflict. The colorful fall foliage and rugged terrain reminded me why I loved this area so much. About 3 days into my week-long trek, I noticed something odd. Small piles of rocks arranged in patterns that didn't seem natural. At first I dismissed it, but as I continued on, I kept spotting more of these strange markers. My instincts from years in the military started to kick in. Something wasn't right. That evening, as I set up camp, I had an uneasy feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But around midnight, I was startled awake by the snap of a twig nearby. Holding my breath, I listened intently. More rustling, whispered voices. I silently slipped out of my tent, knife in hand. In the moonlight, I could make out several shadowy figures moving through the trees, clearly trying to stay hidden. My heart racing, I ducked behind a large oak. What the hell was going on? As my eyes adjusted, I realized with horror that the figures were carrying weapons, rifles, crossbows, even what looked like makeshift spears. This was no normal hiking group. Were they poachers? Some kind of militia? Whatever they were, I knew I was in serious danger. I stayed perfectly still as they passed by, hardly daring to breathe. Once they were a safe distance away, I quickly and quietly packed up my gear. I needed to get the hell out of there and find help. But as I was about to set off, I heard a blood-curdling scream echo through the forest. My blood ran cold. Those bastards were hunting someone. Every instinct told me to run, to save myself. But I couldn't just leave knowing someone else was in danger. Gritting my teeth, I moved in the direction of the scream. As I got closer, I could hear panicked shouting and cruel laughter. Peeking through the undergrowth, I saw a horrifying scene. A young couple was trapped in a net, dangling from a tree. The armed men I'd seen earlier were gathered around them, taunting them and jabbing at them with their weapons. "Please, just let us go," the woman sobbed. "We didn't do anything wrong." One of the men, a huge bearded guy who seemed to be the leader, laughed menacingly. "You trespassed on our hunting grounds. Now you're the prey." I felt sick. These psychos were hunting innocent people for sport. I had to do something, but I was massively outnumbered and outgunned. I needed a plan. Thinking quickly, I grabbed some rocks and sticks and crept around to the other side of the clearing. Taking a deep breath, I started throwing them in different directions, making as much noise as possible. "What was that?" one of the hunters yelled. "Spread out and find them." As they started to disperse to investigate the noises, I used the distraction to quickly move closer to the trapped couple. The leader and one other guy were still guarding them. I picked up a heavy branch and, summoning all my strength, swung it at the leader's head. He went down hard. Before his buddy could react, I tackled him to the ground. We grappled furiously, rolling through the leaves and dirt. He was strong, but I had years of hand-to-hand combat training. I managed to get him in a chokehold until he passed out. Breathing heavily, I cut down the net holding the terrified couple. "Run," I told them. "Head north and don't stop until you reach the ranger station. I'll hold them off." They didn't need to be told twice. As they took off into the woods, I grabbed the unconscious men's weapons. Gunshots rang out as the other hunters realized what was happening and started to return. What followed was the most intense game of cat and mouse I've ever experienced. I used every evasion and survival tactic I knew to stay ahead of them, leading them away from the fleeing couple. For hours we played this deadly game through the mountain forests. Several times they nearly cornered me, bullets whizzing by my head. But I knew these mountains well, using the terrain to my advantage. I set traps, created false trails, and used their own markers against them to confuse and misdirect. As dawn broke, I was exhausted and scraped up, but still free. The hunters seemed to have lost my trail for the moment. I took the opportunity to make a break for it, pushing my tired body to its limits as I raced towards civilization. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I spotted the ranger station through the trees. Relief flooded through me. I burst through the doors, startling the rangers inside. "There are armed men in the forest hunting people," I gasped out. "A couple. They're in danger. We need help." The rangers quickly radioed for backup and got the full story from me. Within the hour, police and Forest Service teams were swarming the area. They found the couple I'd helped escape, cold and frightened, but alive. Over the next few days, an extensive manhunt scoured the mountains. They eventually caught most of the sick bastards who'd been preying on hikers and campers. The investigation revealed this had been going on for years, with dozens of missing persons cases now linked to their hunting activities. I still have nightmares about those dark hours in the forest, the cruel faces of those men as they hunted their human prey. But I'm glad I was able to help put an end to their reign of terror in the mountains. Now, when I hike the Appalachian Trail, I carry an extra sense of vigilance and pride in knowing I played a part in making it safer for everyone to enjoy. The day started like any other on my expedition. I woke up at dawn in my small tent, the crisp morning air nipping at my face as I emerged. After a quick breakfast of granola and coffee, I packed up my gear and set off into the forest. My plan was to hike a few miles to a scenic overlook I'd scouted the day before, where I hoped to photograph some elk or maybe even catch a glimpse of a grizzly bear in the distance. As I trekked through the dense undergrowth, camera equipment weighing heavily on my back, an eerie silence settled over the woods. Usually the forest would be alive with birdsong and the rustling of small animals, but that morning it was oddly still. A chill ran down my spine, and I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I'd spent plenty of time alone in the wilderness before. I hiked for about an hour before reaching the overlook. It was a small clearing on a ridge, offering sweeping views of the valley below and snow-capped mountains in the distance. I set up my tripod and camera, waiting patiently for wildlife to appear. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I snapped a few landscape shots, but the animals remained elusive. Just as I was considering packing up and moving to a new location, I heard a twig snap in the forest behind me. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a moose emerging from the trees. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a hulking, muscular body covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of bear and ape, with a protruding snout, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes that fixed on me with predatory intensity. For a moment, we just stared at each other, frozen in shock. Then the creature let out a bone-chilling roar that shook me to my core. Panic exploded in my chest, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I abandoned my tripod and expensive camera, sprinting headlong into the forest. Behind me, I could hear the thunderous footsteps of the monster as it gave chase. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the underbrush, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I had no idea where I was going. All rational thought had left me, replaced by primal terror and the desperate need to escape. I scrambled over fallen logs and splashed through icy streams. The creature always right behind me. Its growls and roars echoed through the trees, spurring me to run faster than I ever had in my life. At one point, I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the beast loping after me on all fours, covering ground at an alarming rate. Its yellow eyes were locked on me, filled with hunger and rage. I knew that if it caught me, I was dead. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. My lungs were on fire, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I knew I couldn't keep going much longer. Just as I felt my strength giving out, I burst through the tree line onto a narrow dirt road. To my utter disbelief and relief, an old pickup truck was rattling down the road at that very moment. Without thinking, I hurled myself in front of the vehicle, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, tires skidding in the dirt. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, you have to help me." The driver, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked at me in shock. "What in tarnation?" "There's no time," I interrupted, yanking open the passenger door. "We have to go now." Maybe it was the wild look in my eyes or the genuine terror in my voice, but the man didn't argue. As soon as I was in the truck, he floored the accelerator. We peeled away just as the monster burst out of the forest behind us, letting out a furious roar that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I twisted in my seat to look out the back window. The creature loped after us for a few hundred yards, its powerful limbs eating up the distance. For a terrifying moment, I thought it might catch up to the truck, but eventually it fell behind and disappeared back into the forest. As we sped down the road, putting more and more distance between us and the monster, I slumped in my seat, the adrenaline draining from my body. I was shaking uncontrollably, my clothes soaked with sweat and torn from my mad dash through the forest. The driver, whose name I learned was Bill, kept shooting concerned glances my way. "You want to tell me what in the hell that was all about?" he asked. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. How could I possibly explain what I'd just experienced? It sounded insane even to my own ears. I was attacked, I finally managed, by some kind of creature in the forest. Bill's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Creature? What, like a bear?" I shook my head. "No, I don't know what it was. It was huge, and it walked on 2 legs, and..." I trailed off, realizing how crazy I must sound. To his credit, Bill didn't immediately call me a lunatic or kick me out of his truck. He just nodded slowly, a thoughtful look on his weathered face. "You know," he said after a moment, "I've lived in these parts for nigh on 50 years, seen a lot of strange things in these woods, things that don't have names, that most folks wouldn't believe if you told them." A chill ran down my spine at his words. "You mean you've seen something like what I saw?" Bill shrugged. "Can't say for sure, but I know there's things out there that ain't in any biology textbook, things that don't want to be found." We drove in silence for a while after that, the Alaskan wilderness rolling by outside the windows. Bill was kind enough to drive me all the way back to the small town where I'd started my expedition. As he dropped me off at the local motel, he gave me a stern look. "Word of advice, son. Stick to the tourist trails from now on. Some parts of this country ain't meant for people to be poking around in." I nodded, grateful for his help and wisdom. As I watched him drive away, I knew my days as a solo wildlife photographer were over. The terror of that chase through the forest would stay with me forever, along with the lingering question of what exactly I had encountered out there. To this day, I've never told anyone else the full story of what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman roar ringing in my ears. And I know, with absolute certainty, that there are monsters in this world, real flesh and blood monsters, lurking in the dark corners of the wilderness, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble into their domain. I count myself lucky to have escaped with my life that day. But I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the vast Alaskan wilderness, that creature is still roaming. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers me too. The trouble began on my third day out. I was driving along a dusty track miles from the nearest town when my engine started making an ominous rattling sound. Within minutes, it sputtered and died completely. No amount of tinkering could coax it back to life. As the realization of my predicament sank in, a chill ran down my spine despite the scorching heat. I tried the satellite phone, but couldn't get a signal. Of course, I thought bitterly. My supplies would last a few days if I rationed carefully, but without transportation, I was in serious trouble. The nearest settlement was over 100 miles away, an impossible trek in this unforgiving landscape. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and purples, I set up camp beside my stranded vehicle. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and an eerie stillness settled over the desert. That's when I heard it, a haunting howl in the distance that made my blood run cold. Dingoes. I'd been warned about the wild dogs, but foolishly assumed they wouldn't be a threat to someone in a vehicle. Now, alone and exposed, that assumption seemed dangerously naive. I quickly gathered my meager supplies and looked for a defensive position. About 50 yards away, I spotted a rocky outcropping that looked climbable. Without a second thought, I sprinted towards it, my heart pounding. I had just started scrambling up the rocks when I heard the panting and scrabbling of paws behind me. Glancing back, I saw several lean, wolf-like shapes emerging from the gathering darkness. Their eyes gleamed with predatory focus. With a surge of adrenaline, I clawed my way higher, scraping my hands and knees on the rough stone. Reaching a narrow ledge about 15 feet up, I pressed myself against the rock face, gasping for breath. Below, I could hear the dingoes circling, their occasional yips and growls sending shivers through me. I was safe for the moment, but trapped. As full darkness fell, the desert came alive with unfamiliar sounds. The dingoes remained, their presence a constant threat. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every noise, terrified of rolling off my precarious perch. The night seemed to last an eternity. With the first gray light of dawn, I peered down to assess my situation. Most of the pack had withdrawn, but 2 dingoes remained, pacing restlessly at the base of the rocks. They looked lean and hungry, their ribs visible beneath matted fur. I knew they wouldn't give up easily. I had to find a way down and back to my vehicle. My water supply was dangerously low, and I needed to signal for help somehow. Scanning the rocks, I spotted a possible route down the opposite side of the formation. It would be a risky climb, but I had no choice. Moving slowly to avoid drawing attention, I began picking my way across the top of the outcropping. The rough stone bit into my hands, and my muscles screamed in protest after hours of tense immobility. A loose rock clattered down, and I froze as the dingoes below perked up, alert to my movement. I had nearly reached the far side when disaster struck. A handhold I thought secure suddenly crumbled, sending me sliding down the rock face. I managed to catch myself, but not before letting out an involuntary yelp of pain and fear. The dingoes exploded into action, racing around the formation towards the sound of my voice. Panic gave me strength, and I half climbed, half fell down the remaining distance. I hit the ground running, heading for my vehicle with everything I had. Behind me, I could hear the scrabble of paws on stone as the dingoes descended. The race back to the 4-4 was a blur of burning lungs and thundering heartbeat. I could feel hot breath on my heels as I reached the car, fumbling desperately with the door handle. As I wrenched it open, teeth snapped shut inches from my leg. I dove inside, slamming the door just as a heavy weight thudded against it. Safe inside the metal shell, I collapsed against the seat, sucking in great gulps of air. Outside, the dingoes circled and scratched at the doors, their frustrated howls piercing the morning air. For hours, I huddled in the vehicle as the sun climbed higher, turning it into an oven. The dingoes eventually withdrew to find shade, but I knew they were still out there, waiting. My water was almost gone, and the heat was becoming unbearable. I had to try the satellite phone again. Crawling into the back, I dug out the device with shaking hands. I held it up, moving it slowly, searching desperately for a signal. Nothing. Nothing. Then, a single bar flickered to life. I could have wept with relief. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I punched in the emergency number. The call connected, and I babbled out my location and situation to the calm voice on the other end. Help was coming, they assured me. I just had to hold on. Those next few hours were among the longest of my life. The heat was suffocating, and dehydration made my thoughts fuzzy. Several times I saw movement outside and tensed, fearing the dingoes had returned. But the shadows always resolved into wind-blown shrubs or heat shimmer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the thrum of helicopter blades. As the aircraft appeared on the horizon, the last of my strength gave out. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was being lifted onto a stretcher by rescue workers. The following days passed in a haze of hospital rooms and police interviews. Physical recovery was relatively quick, but the psychological scars ran deeper. For weeks after, I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear howling outside my window. It's been months now, and I still get uneasy when I see a dog that resembles a dingo. My dreams are often filled with endless red deserts and gleaming predator eyes. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the terror of those hours spent trapped on that rock, or the desperate race back to my car. People often ask if this experience has cured me of my adventurous streak. The truth is, it's given me a new respect for the raw power of nature and the thin line between life and death in extreme environments. I'll adventure again, but never again will I take such risks lightly or overestimate my own abilities. The Australian outback holds a stark, terrible beauty, but it's a beauty that demands respect, a lesson I learned in the hardest possible way. Those dingoes may haunt my nightmares, but they also taught me the true meaning of survival. It's an experience I'll carry with me always, a reminder of both human fragility and resilience in the face of nature's indifferent brutality. I was always drawn to the eerie allure of ghost towns. As a travel blogger specializing in off-the-beaten-path destinations, I'd visited my fair share of abandoned places, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in that remote California town. It was supposed to be a routine trip, drive out to the Mojave Desert, explore some forgotten gold rush settlements, take some photos for my blog. I'd done it dozens of times before. This time, I decided to check out a lesser-known ghost town called Hollow Creek. It wasn't on many maps, but I'd heard whispers about it in online urbex forums. Supposedly, it was one of the best-preserved ghost towns in the state, largely untouched since it was abandoned in the 1940s. The drive out there was long and lonely. Miles of empty desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or weathered boulder. As I followed the faded dirt road leading to Hollow Creek, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. The air seemed to grow thick and oppressive, despite the arid climate. An inexplicable sense of dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to shake it off as I crested a small hill and caught my first glimpse of Hollow Creek below. From a distance, it looked picture-perfect, a cluster of weathered wooden buildings nestled in a shallow valley, frozen in time. But as I drew closer, that feeling of wrongness intensified. The town was eerily silent, without even the sound of wind or birds. The buildings cast strange, elongated shadows that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Parking at the edge of town, I grabbed my camera and began exploring on foot. Up close, Hollow Creek was even more unsettling. Many of the buildings still had furniture and personal belongings inside, as if the residents had simply vanished into thin air midday. Dust-covered dishes sat on kitchen tables. Moth-eaten clothes hung in closets. In one house, I found a half-finished letter dated June 17, 1943, the pen lying beside it as if the writer had been suddenly interrupted. As I wandered the empty streets taking photos, that creeping sense of dread continued to grow. The shadows seemed to deepen and stretch, even though it was only early afternoon. More than once, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The air felt heavy and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. I tried to rationalize it, just my imagination running wild in this spooky setting. But then I heard it, a woman's voice, distant and faint, calling out wordlessly. I spun around, heart racing, but saw no one. The voice came again, closer this time, almost like a wail of anguish. "Hello," I called out, my own voice sounding small and frightened. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then a flicker of movement down a nearby alley. I caught a glimpse of what looked like a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her form blurry and indistinct. She vanished around a corner before I could get a good look. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. This couldn't be real, and yet I found myself following, drawn by a mix of terror and morbid curiosity. As I turned the corner, I saw her again at the end of the street. This time she was facing me, and I got my first clear look at her face. What I saw chilled me to my very core. Her features were gaunt and twisted, eyes sunken and glowing with an unnatural light. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. As our eyes met, She began gliding towards me with unnatural speed. Panic seized me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that horrifying apparition. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel her just behind me, her icy presence raising goosebumps on my skin. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw her reaching for me with elongated claw-like fingers. In my panic, I didn't see the rotted floorboards until it was too late. My foot went through, sending me sprawling onto the dusty ground. I scrambled to get up, but my ankle was trapped. The ghostly woman loomed over me, her face a mask of hunger and madness. I screwed my eyes shut, certain this was the end. But then, miraculously, I felt my ankle come free. Without thinking, I lurched to my feet and ran blindly. I don't know how long I ran for. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually I found myself back at my car, shaking and drenched in cold sweat. I peeled out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally allowed myself to slow down and try to process what had happened. Had it all been some kind of hallucination brought on by heat and dehydration? A vivid waking nightmare? Or had I truly encountered something supernatural in that godforsaken town? I still don't have answers. In the weeks since, I've scoured historical records trying to find information about Hollow Creek and its residents. But it's like the town never existed. There are no records, no newspaper articles, nothing to corroborate what I saw. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement in a mirror or feel an icy presence behind me, and I'm right back in that moment of terror. The ghost woman's face haunts my nightmares. I can still hear her wailing call echoing in my mind. I don't know what really happened in Hollow Creek, but I know I'll never go back there or to any other ghost town ever again. Some places are meant to stay abandoned, their secrets buried in the dust of time. And some ghosts are better left undisturbed. I've given up my travel blog. These days, I stick to well-populated areas and brightly lit spaces. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of Hollow Creek. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can hear that woman's voice calling to me from just beyond the veil of reality. And I live in fear of the day she finds me again. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from ghost towns, especially ones that aren't on any map. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and some things are better left forgotten. I'll never be able to forget what I saw in Hollow Creek. The memory of that day is seared into my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that lurk in the shadows of forgotten places, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble upon them. I often find myself wondering about the fate of Hollow Creek's original inhabitants. Did they fall victim to the same malevolent presence I encountered? Or were they themselves transformed into the ghostly beings that now haunt the town? The half-finished letter I found keeps replaying in my mind. What urgent event interrupted the writer? What calamity befell the town to make its residents vanish so suddenly? In my darkest moments, I fear that by entering Hollow Creek, I've somehow tied my fate to that of the town. The ghostly woman's face appears in my dreams, her haunting wail echoing in my ears. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I can feel her icy fingers brushing against my skin. I've tried to move on with my life, to forget about what happened, but it's always there, lingering at the edges of my consciousness. I find myself jumping at shadows, avoiding mirrors, and sleeping with the lights on. Crowded places that once made me feel claustrophobic now bring a sense of comfort. At least here, surrounded by the living, I feel somewhat protected from whatever followed me out of that ghost town. But in quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before the entities of Hollow Creek come for me again. That one day, I'll turn around and find that ghostly woman standing behind me, ready to drag me back to whatever hellish dimension she came from. I don't know if sharing this story will help keep others away from Hollow Creek, or if it will only draw more curious thrill seekers to that cursed place. But I had to get it off my chest to try and exorcise these memories that haunt me day and night. If nothing else, let my experience serve as a warning. There are some mysteries better left unsolved, some places better left unexplored. The world is full of wonders, yes, but it also harbors ancient, malevolent forces beyond our comprehension. I learned that lesson the hard way in Hollow Creek, and I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when those forces will catch up with me again. As I pulled into the gravel parking lot, I immediately felt uneasy. The place looked run down and neglected, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds everywhere. But I was too tired to be picky, so I grabbed my overnight bag and headed to the office. The bell above the door jangled loudly as I entered. An old man with wispy gray hair sat behind the desk, his roomy eyes fixed on a small TV playing static. He didn't even look up as I approached. Excuse me," I said. "I'd like a room for the night." Slowly, he turned to face me. His gaze was unsettling, like he was looking right through me. Without a word, he reached behind him and grabbed a key off the wall. "Room 13, he rasped, sliding the key across the counter. "That'll be $40 cash." I hesitated. Everything about this place felt wrong. But it was late, I was exhausted, and the next town was over an hour away. Reluctantly, I handed over 2 crumpled $20 bills. As I walked to my room, the gravel crunching under my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air felt heavy and oppressive, like the moments before a thunderstorm. A cold wind whipped through the trees, causing the branches to scrape against the motel's weathered siding. Room 13 was at the very end of the building. The key stuck in the lock, and I had to jiggle it several times before the door finally creaked open. The smell of must and mildew hit me immediately. The room was small and dingy, with faded floral wallpaper peeling at the corners. A single bed with a sagging mattress took up most of the space. The only other furniture was a rickety desk and chair. I set my bag down and went to check the bathroom. The tiles were cracked and stained, and rust-colored water dripped slowly from the faucet. But at this point, I was too tired to care. I just wanted to sleep. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd. There was a small wooden chair placed directly in front of the window, facing out into the darkness. I'm not sure why, but the sight of it made my skin crawl. I quickly drew the threadbare curtains closed. I climbed into bed, trying to ignore the musty smell of the sheets. Despite my exhaustion, sleep wouldn't come. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound jolted me awake. It was faint at first, a low rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere outside. As I listened, it grew louder and more insistent. Thump, thump, thump. My heart racing, I sat up in bed. The sound seemed to be coming from right outside my window. Thump, thump, thump. Suddenly, a shadow passed across the curtains, the unmistakable silhouette of a person. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. The thumping stopped. For several long moments there was only silence. Then slowly, deliberately, something began to scratch at the window. The sound of nails dragging across glass sent chills down my spine. I wanted to run, to scream, but fear kept me rooted in place. The scratching continued, growing more frenzied with each passing second. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen illuminated, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. It was 3:33 a.m. As I stared at the time, movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. My blood ran cold as I realized the wooden chair by the window was slowly turning to face the bed. That was it. Pure panic overwhelmed me, and I leapt out of bed, fumbling for my keys and bag. I didn't even bother putting on shoes. I just ran. As I burst out of the room, the cool night air hit me like a slap in the face. The parking lot was shrouded in a thick, unnatural fog. I could barely see my car just a few feet away. I sprinted across the gravel, my bare feet scraping painfully with each step. Just as I reached for my car door, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My hands shook violently as I tried to get the key in the lock. The screaming continued, growing closer with each passing second. Finally, the door opened and I dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My heart nearly stopped. Standing in the fog, just inches from my back bumper, was a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long for its body. But what terrified me most was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, blank expanse of skin. I slammed on the gas, tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my mirror, I saw the figure give chase, moving with impossible speed on its stilt-like legs. I drove recklessly, pushing my old car to its limits as I fled down the dark highway. My eyes darted constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, terrified of what I might see gaining on me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I finally saw lights in the distance. A 24-hour gas station appeared like an oasis in the desert. I pulled in, tires screeching, and ran inside. The teenage clerk looked startled as I burst through the doors, wild-eyed and barefoot. I must have looked insane as I babbled about the motel and the thing chasing me. He just stared at me blankly before asking if I wanted to call the police. I spent the rest of the night in that fluorescent-lit gas station, jumping at every sound and shadow. When dawn finally broke, I ventured back out to my car. There was no sign of my pursuer. With shaking hands, I pulled up my GPS to see how far I'd driven. My blood ran cold as I realized there was no record of a Pinewood motel anywhere in the area. In fact, according to the map, I had been driving through nothing but dense forest for miles. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just an exhaustion-fueled hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear the faint sound of scratching at my window, and the terror comes flooding back. I don't know what that thing was or why it targeted me. All I know is that I'll never forget the blank, featureless face of the entity that chased me through the fog. And I'll never stay in another roadside motel as long as I live. My daughter Megan had recently moved to a remote cabin in the Rocky Mountains to work on her novel. As a struggling writer in her late 20s, she thought the solitude and natural beauty would inspire her creativity. I was a bit worried about her being so isolated, but she assured me she'd be fine. After not hearing from her for a couple weeks, I decided to surprise her with a visit. I figured we could spend some quality time together, maybe do some hiking, and I could make sure she was settling in okay. The drive up into the mountains was breathtaking. Towering evergreens lined the winding roads as I climbed higher in elevation. The crisp mountain air felt invigorating as I rolled down the windows. By early afternoon, I reached the turnoff for the dirt road leading to Megan's cabin. As I bumped along the rough path, the forest grew denser. Hardly any sunlight filtered through the thick canopy above. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Something about the deep shadows between the trees felt off. I tried to shake the sensation, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Finally, I rounded a bend and saw Megan's little wooden cabin nestled in a small clearing. Relief washed over me at the sight. I parked and eagerly knocked on the door, excited to see my daughter's face. But as the door creaked open, my smile faded. Megan looked awful. Dark circles under her bloodshot eyes, hair disheveled, skin pale. She seemed shocked to see me. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, voice raspy. "I wanted to surprise you, sweetheart. Are you feeling okay? You look sick." She glanced nervously over her shoulder before ushering me inside. "I'm fine, just haven't been sleeping well. Come in quickly." The cabin's interior was a mess, papers strewn about, dirty dishes piled in the sink, clothes scattered on the floor. This wasn't like my usually tidy daughter at all. "Megan, what's going on? Talk to me," I said gently, growing more concerned. She paced anxiously, wringing her hands. I don't know how to explain it, Dad. You'll think I'm crazy." "Try me. I promise I'll listen with an open mind." Megan took a deep breath. "For the past week I've been seeing things in the woods. Men, I think, but not normal men. They move in unnatural ways, too fast and fluid. And their eyes glow in the dark." A chill ran down my spine. "Have you called the police?" She laughed bitterly. "And tell them what? That I'm being stalked by inhuman creatures? They'd think I was on drugs." "Maybe it's just some locals trying to scare you off the property," I suggested, trying to find a rational explanation. Megan shook her head vehemently. "No, Dad, these aren't people in costumes. There's something seriously wrong here. I've tried to leave twice, but every time I pack up my car, they appear on the road, blocking my way. I'm trapped." I pulled her into a hug, feeling her trembling. "It's okay, sweetie. I'm here now. We'll figure this out together." We spent the next few hours going over every detail of her experiences. She showed me her frantic journal entries describing the entities, along with some crude sketches. The drawings sent ice through my veins, elongated limbs, impossibly wide mouths filled with needle-like teeth, eyes like black voids. What the hell was going on here? As the sun began to set, Megan grew more agitated. "They always come out at night," she whispered. "We need to secure all the doors and windows." I helped her board up the windows and push heavy furniture in front of the doors. My mind was reeling, torn between concern for my daughter's mental state and a growing dread that she might be telling the truth. Night fell quickly in the mountains. We huddled together in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, every creak of the cabin making us jump. I tried to keep Megan calm by reminiscing about happier times, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. Around midnight, a blood-curdling screech pierced the air outside. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, more like metal scraping on metal, but with an organic, guttural quality that made my skin crawl. Megan whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. "They're here," she whispered. I held her close, heart pounding. "It's okay. It's probably just a mountain lion or something," I said, not believing my own words. The screech came again, closer this time. Then another answered from the opposite direction. They were surrounding us. Suddenly, something slammed against the front door, making the whole cabin shudder. The boards we'd nailed over the windows began to splinter and crack. Oh, God," Megan sobbed. I looked around frantically for a weapon, grabbing a fireplace poker. A long, spindly arm punched through one of the boarded windows, feeling around blindly. Its skin was a sickly grayish white, almost translucent. I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. I swung the poker with all my might, connecting with the creature's arm. It let out an inhuman shriek and withdrew, but not before I caught a glimpse of its face peering through the broken boards. Those eyes, like bottomless pits of darkness. I'll never forget them as long as I live. More arms began breaking through the other windows. The front door buckled and splintered as something massive threw itself against it repeatedly. "The basement!" Megan shouted over the cacophony of screeches and breaking wood. "There's a storm cellar with a metal door!" We raced for the trap door in the kitchen floor, the sounds of the creatures entering the cabin right behind us. I slammed the heavy metal door shut just as twisted corpse-like hands reached for us. We huddled in the dank cellar, listening to the chaos above. Inhuman howls and the sounds of destruction filled the air. I held Megan close, murmuring that everything would be okay, praying I wasn't lying. After what felt like hours, the noises began to subside. Eventually, an eerie silence fell. We waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any sign of the creatures. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the cracks of the cellar door, we finally dared to emerge. The cabin was in shambles, furniture overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls, windows shattered, but the creatures were gone. We didn't waste a second. We threw some essential items into a bag and ran for my car. As I gunned the engine and sped down the mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those things chasing us, but there was nothing except empty forest behind us. We drove for hours without stopping, putting as much distance between us and that nightmare as possible. Megan slept fitfully in the passenger seat, whimpering occasionally. I couldn't shake the image of those grotesque arms reaching for us, those soulless eyes peering through the broken boards. It's been a month since that hellish night, and we still have no explanation for what happened. Megan is in therapy, trying to process the trauma. I've tried to report it to the authorities, but as we feared, they just think we're crazy or on drugs. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just some kind of shared delusion or hallucination. But then I look at the scars on my arm from where one of those things grabbed me, and I know it was real. Whatever those creatures were, they exist, and they're still out there in those mountains waiting. We've vowed never to return to that place. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but I can't help feeling that our encounter with those entities was just the tip of the iceberg. What if there are more of them out there? What if they decide to leave the mountains? All I know is that I'll never look at the forest the same way again. In the darkest depths of the wilderness, there are things beyond human understanding, things that should remain hidden, and God help us if they ever decide to fully reveal themselves to the world. I was always drawn to the thrill of urban exploration, seeking out abandoned places to uncover their hidden secrets. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in that old mansion on the outskirts of a small New England town. It was a crisp autumn day when I first laid eyes on the imposing structure. Nestled among overgrown trees and tangled vines, the once grand Victorian mansion loomed before me like something out of a Gothic horror novel. Paint peeled from weathered wood siding, windows were boarded up or broken, and the wraparound porch sagged ominously. Despite its decrepit state, there was an undeniable allure, a siren song calling me to explore its forgotten rooms and shadowy corridors. I'd done my research beforehand, as always. The mansion had been abandoned for decades after the wealthy family who owned it mysteriously vanished in the 1920s. There were rumors of occult practices, of seances gone wrong, but nothing concrete, just the kind of intriguing backstory that made for a perfect exploration. As I approached the front entrance, an eerie stillness settled over the property. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just absolute silence. A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off as pre-exploration jitters. I'd felt that nervous excitement many times before. This was no different, I told myself. The front door was locked, but I found a partially open window on the side of the house. As I climbed through, the floorboards creaked ominously under my weight. Dust motes swirled in the stale air, illuminated by weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam around what appeared to be a sitting room. Tattered furniture draped in yellowed sheets, cobweb-covered bookshelves, a grand piano with its lid propped open, as if waiting for ghostly fingers to dance across the ivory keys. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for who knows how long. I made my way deeper into the house, documenting my findings with my camera. Each room held its own forgotten stories: a child's bedroom with faded circus-themed wallpaper, a study filled with leather-bound books, a kitchen where rusted pots and pans still hung from hooks. It wasn't until I reached the second floor that things took a turn for the strange. As I ascended the grand staircase, I could have sworn I heard faint whispers echoing from somewhere above. I paused, straining my ears, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. Must be the wind, I reasoned, ignoring the fact that the air was completely still. The upper floor was a maze of bedrooms and sitting areas. In one room, an ornate mirror caught my eye. As I approached to examine it closer, a chill ran through me. For just a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing behind me in the reflection. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My hands shook slightly as I snapped a few photos of the mirror. This place was starting to get to me. I needed to finish up and get out of here. But as I turned to leave, something made me freeze in my tracks. There, at the end of the hallway, was a woman in an old-fashioned dress. She stood motionless, staring right at me. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, she was gone. My heart was racing now, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Part of me wanted to bolt right then and there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if what I'd seen was real. With shaking hands, I pulled out my EMF meter. The needle was going crazy, spiking well into the red zone. I'd never seen readings like this before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the oppressive silence. "Is anyone there?" No response, just the creaking of old floorboards beneath my feet. I pushed onward, determined to explore every inch of this place before I left. The third floor held more bedrooms, plus what looked like servants' quarters. Nothing too out of the ordinary, aside from the persistent feeling of being watched. It wasn't until I reached the attic that things truly went sideways. As soon as I pushed open the creaky door, I was hit with a blast of frigid air. My breath came out in visible puffs, despite it being a warm day outside. The attic was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, all covered in a thick layer of dust. Cobwebs clung to every surface, but it was what I saw in the far corner that made my blood run cold. A group of people, men and women in old-fashioned clothing, were huddled together as if in the midst of some kind of ritual. They were translucent, flickering like an old film projection, and they were looking right at me. I stumbled backward, my camera clattering to the floor. This couldn't be real. I had to be hallucinating. But as I watched in horror, one of the figures, a severe-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, began to move towards me. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but all I heard was a bone-chilling wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The other figures joined in, their ethereal forms advancing on me. Panic took over. I turned and ran, nearly falling down the stairs in my haste to escape. But as I reached the second floor, I realized with growing dread that things had changed. The layout was different. Doors where there hadn't been before, hallways twisting in impossible ways. I could hear the wailing growing louder, feel an unnatural cold at my back. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on monstrous shapes. I ran blindly, no longer caring about anything but getting out of this nightmare. Every door I tried was locked. Windows wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was trying to keep me trapped. The spirits were getting closer. I could feel their icy presence just behind me. In desperation, I threw myself at a window at the end of the hall. The old, brittle glass shattered on impact. I didn't even feel the cuts as I scrambled through the opening, tumbling onto the overgrown lawn below. I ran. Ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. Ran until the mansion was far behind me, and I found myself on the main road leading into town. Only then did I allow myself to stop and catch my breath. Looking back, I could see the mansion in the distance. It stood silent and still, looking for all the world like any other abandoned building. But I knew the truth of what lurked inside those walls. I've explored many places in my life, seen things that defy explanation, but nothing comes close to the terror I experienced in that New England mansion. The images of those spectral figures still haunt my dreams. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I can hear those unearthly wails echoing in the darkness. I don't know what exactly happened in that house all those years ago. What dark rituals or tragic events left such a powerful imprint? All I know is that some places are better left unexplored. Some secrets should remain buried in the past. I've given up urban exploration since that day. The thrill isn't worth the risk of encountering something like that again. But a part of me wonders how many other forgotten places out there hold similar horrors. How thin is the veil between our world and whatever lies beyond? One thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in that mansion again. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed, and some experiences change you forever, leaving you with questions that can never be answered and fears that can never be fully shaken. If you're ever driving through New England and come across an old abandoned mansion hidden away in the woods, keep driving. Don't let curiosity get the better of you, because you never know what might be waiting inside, eager for new victims to add to its supernatural ranks. As for me, I'm done chasing ghosts, but I can't shake the feeling that they're not done with me. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of shadowy figures, and on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear those whispers, calling me back to that cursed place. But I'll resist. I have to, because I know that if I ever return, I might never leave again. Following the signs, I soon came upon a charming Victorian house nestled in a clearing. Warm light spilled from the windows, and flower boxes bursting with mums adorned the wraparound porch. It looked like the perfect cozy spot to spend the night. I parked my car and walked up to the front door, admiring the intricate gingerbread trim and stained glass accents. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and I was greeted by a smiling older woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun. "Welcome, dear. I'm Mrs. Rosewood. Come in out of the chill," she said, ushering me inside. The entryway was warm and inviting, with polished wood floors and wallpaper in a delicate floral print. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and apples. Mrs. Rosewood led me to a small desk to check in. As I filled out the guest book, I noticed there were only a handful of other names listed for the past month. "Not too busy this time of year?" I asked. "Oh, we like to keep things quiet and intimate here," she replied with a wink. "Now, let me show you to your room. I'm sure you must be tired from your journey." She led me up a creaky staircase to the second floor. My room was at the end of the hall, a cozy space with a four-poster bed, antique furniture, and lace curtains. It was charmingly old-fashioned, though I noticed a faint musty smell underneath the potpourri scent. "Breakfast is at 8 sharp," Mrs. Rosewood informed me. "Sleep well, dear." With that, she left me to settle in. I unpacked a few things and got ready for bed, looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep. But as I lay there in the darkness, I began to feel uneasy. The house creaked and groaned, as old houses do, but some of the sounds seemed off, like shuffling footsteps or muffled voices. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just an unfamiliar place, but I tossed and turned for hours, unable to fully relax. Finally, I decided to get up and make myself a cup of tea to calm my nerves. The hallway was pitch black as I crept towards the stairs. My hand fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch. Suddenly, my fingers brushed against something sticky and damp. I jerked my hand back with a gasp. Heart pounding, I finally found the switch and flicked it on. The hall lit up, and I saw dark red smears on the wallpaper where I'd touched it. It looked horribly like blood. I told myself it had to be something else, maybe rust from a leaky pipe. But a chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong here. I hurried down the stairs, no longer caring about being quiet. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I reached the ground floor, I heard voices coming from behind a closed door, Mrs. Rosewood and a man arguing in hushed, urgent tones. "We can't keep doing this," the man was saying. "Someone's going to catch on eventually." "Nonsense," Mrs. Rosewood replied sharply. "I've been running this place for 40 years without any problems. As long as we're careful, no one will ever know." "Know what?" My mind raced with terrible possibilities. I needed to leave now. I crept towards the front door, praying the old floorboards wouldn't creak. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, a floorboard let out a loud groan. The voices in the other room went silent. Panic surged through me. I yanked open the door and burst outside into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard Mrs. Rosewood call out, "Wait! Come back!" But there was no way I was stopping. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys. Just as I got the door open, I saw Mrs. Rosewood emerge from the house. Even in the dim porch light, I could see dark stains on her apron. I leapt into the car and peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying. In my rearview mirror, I saw Mrs. Rosewood growing smaller in the distance, still calling after me. My hands shook as I drove, putting as much distance between me and that house as possible. What the hell had I stumbled into? My mind conjured up images of secret tunnels, hidden bodies, gruesome rituals. I shuddered, realizing how close I'd come to becoming another victim. It wasn't until I'd driven for over an hour that I finally felt safe enough to pull over at a rest stop. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion hit me hard. I locked the car doors and tried to get some sleep in the back seat, but my dreams were plagued by visions of bloody walls and Mrs. Rosewood's too wide smile. When morning came, I debated whether to go to the police. But what could I tell them? I had no real evidence of wrongdoing, just my own wild speculations. They'd probably think I was crazy or making it all up. In the end, I decided to continue on my trip and try to put the whole thing behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape from something truly sinister. To this day, I avoid small country B&Bs. You never know what dark secrets may be hiding behind those quaint facades. As I drove away that morning, a part of me wanted to go back and investigate further, to uncover the truth about what was really going on at Rosewood B&B. But a larger part of me was simply grateful to have made it out alive. I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, or the chilling realization that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep into the shadows. You might not like what you find there. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares of that place. The creak of floorboards makes me jump, and I can never quite scrub away the phantom feeling of sticky wetness on my fingers when I touch a wall in the dark. I don't know what Mrs. Rosewood's true nature was, or what horrors that house might have contained. But I do know that I came far too close to finding out firsthand. Whatever secrets lie hidden in that idyllic country B&B, they'll remain a mystery to me, and I'm okay with that. Some questions are better left unanswered. I looked up to see Jake, one of our former bellhops who'd been fired last week, stumbling into the lobby. My heart dropped when I saw the gun in his hand. "Everyone get down," Jake shouted, waving the weapon wildly. "Nobody move, or I'll start shooting." Panic exploded through the lobby. Guests screamed and dove for cover behind furniture. I saw a young mother clutching her toddler, both of them shaking with fear. I slowly raised my hands, trying to project calm even as my pulse raced. "Jake, what are you doing? Let's talk about this." His eyes were wild, darting around the room. "Shut up. You don't get to talk. You ruined my life." I took a deep breath, desperately trying to think of how to diffuse this situation. There were at least a dozen guests in the lobby, plus my staff. If this went wrong, people could die. "I know you're upset about losing your job," I said carefully, "but this isn't the way to handle it. Why don't you put the gun down and we can discuss this?" "Discuss what?" Jake snarled. "How you fired me for no reason. How I can't pay my rent now. How my life is over." "Your life isn't over, Jake. We can figure this out, but first I need you to lower the weapon." He jabbed the gun towards me. "Don't tell me what to do. I'm in charge now." I could see Jake's hand shaking. He was scared and desperate, a dangerous combination. I had to keep him talking, keep him focused on me instead of the terrified guests. "Okay, you're in charge," I said, keeping my voice steady. "What do you want?" "I want my job back," he shouted, "and I want that bitch Lisa fired for lying about me." Lisa was our head of housekeeping. She'd reported Jake for harassing female guests, which led to his termination. I knew the allegations were true. We had video evidence. But contradicting Jake now would only enrage him further. "I hear you," I said. "Losing your job was hard, but taking hostages won't solve anything. It will only make things worse. Why don't we sit down and talk about this? I promise to hear you out." For a moment, I thought I was getting through to him. Jake's grip on the gun loosened slightly, but then a cell phone rang somewhere in the lobby. Jake whirled towards the sound, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I said no phones," he screamed. "Who's calling the cops? I'll shoot, I swear I will." "No one's calling anyone," I said quickly, stepping out from behind the desk. I had to regain control of the situation before someone got hurt. "It was probably just a guest's alarm going off. Everything's okay." Jake turned back to me, his eyes narrowing. "Don't come any closer. I'm warning you." I held up my hands. "I'm not trying anything. I just want to talk face to face, man to man." I took another slow step forward. Jake's gaze was fixed on me now, the gun pointed at my chest. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. But I kept my face neutral, my movements calm and deliberate. You don't want to hurt anyone, Jake, I said softly. I know you're a good person who's going through a rough time, but this isn't you. This isn't who you really are. I was close enough now that I could see the sweat beading on Jake's forehead, the slight tremor in his hand. He was starting to waver. Put the gun down, I urged gently. Let's talk about this like rational adults. I promise I'll listen to everything you have to say. Jake's resolve was crumbling. I could see the conflict in his eyes. For a moment I thought he was going to surrender, but then something hardened in his expression. No, he growled. You're trying to trick me. I won't let you win. He raised the gun higher, aiming for my head. In that split second, I knew I had to act or die. I lunged forward, grabbing for the weapon. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening bang. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me moving. We grappled for control of the gun, crashing into furniture. I could hear screams and shattering glass, but I stayed focused on the life or death struggle. Jake was younger and stronger, but desperation gave me an edge. I managed to wrench the gun away, sending it skittering across the floor. But Jake wasn't done fighting. He swung wildly, his fist connecting with my jaw. I staggered back, tasting blood. Jake charged at me, trying to tackle me to the ground. I sidestepped at the last second, using his momentum to slam him into the front desk. Before he could recover, I grabbed him in a chokehold. Jake thrashed and clawed at my arms, but I held on with every ounce of strength I had left. It's over, I gasped. Stop fighting. Gradually, Jake's struggles weakened. I maintained my hold until he went limp in my arms. Only then did I ease him to the ground, making sure he was just unconscious and still breathing. As the adrenaline faded, the pain in my shoulder flared to life. I looked down to see blood soaking through my shirt. The bullet had grazed me, but the wound wasn't deep. I became aware of the chaos around me: overturned furniture, broken glass, terrified guests huddled in corners. But everyone was alive. We'd made it through. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. I sagged against the front desk, suddenly exhausted. It was over. We were safe. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, paramedic checkups, and calls from corporate. By the time things calmed down, the sun was rising. I stood in the wrecked lobby, surveying the damage. We'd have a lot of work to do to get the hotel back in order, but we'd rebuild. We'd recover. A maid approached me hesitantly. "Sir, are you all right?" I managed a tired smile. "I'm okay. How are you holding up?" She shook her head in disbelief. "I can't believe what you did. You saved all our lives." I shrugged my uninjured shoulder. "I just did what I had to do. We all got through this together." But as I looked around at my shaken but safe staff and guests, a wave of emotion hit me. We'd faced death tonight and emerged on the other side. Nothing would ever be quite the same. I cleared my throat. "All right, everyone, let's get this place cleaned up. We've got guests checking in at 3 p.m. There were some surprised laughs at that, but people started pitching in, clearing debris and righting furniture. Slowly but surely, the Pinewood Hotel began to put itself back together. As for me, I knew I'd be replaying the night's events in my mind for a long time to come. The weight of the gun in my hand, the terror in Jake's eyes, the moment I thought it was all over. But we'd survived, and in the end, that's what mattered most. We'd faced the unthinkable and come out the other side, changed perhaps, but still standing, still moving forward. I took a deep breath and got back to work. There was a hotel to run after all, and after tonight, I knew we could handle anything that came our way. It was a slow Tuesday night, around 2 a.m. I was at the front desk going through some paperwork when a man walked in. He was tall and lanky, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. Something about him immediately set me on edge, though I couldn't put my finger on why. "I need a room for the night," he mumbled, not making eye contact. His voice was low and gravelly. I went through the standard check-in process, asking for ID and a credit card. When he handed over his driver's license, I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. As I input his information, I kept glancing up at him. He was fidgeting nervously, eyes darting around the lobby. It wasn't until I handed back his ID that I saw it, a jagged scar running from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw. My blood ran cold as I realized why he looked so familiar. For the past few weeks, there had been warnings circulating about a serial killer operating in the area. The police had released a description, including a distinctive facial scar. This man matched it perfectly. I tried to keep my composure as I finished the check-in, willing my hands not to shake as I handed him his key card. "You're in room 237. Enjoy your stay," I managed to say, my mouth dry. As soon as he was out of sight, I collapsed into my chair, heart pounding. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just accuse a guest of being a murderer without proof. But if I was right, I couldn't let him walk away either. I pulled up the police bulletin on my phone, comparing the description to what I'd seen. Height, build, age range, it all matched. And that scar was unmistakable. My mind was racing. Should I call the police right away? But what if I was wrong? I could lose my job, maybe even face legal trouble for false accusations. I needed to be sure. I decided to do some investigating on my own first. Using the hotel's security system, I pulled up the camera feeds. Most of the halls were dark and empty at this hour. I located the man on the second floor, walking to his room. He kept looking over his shoulder nervously. Once he was in his room, I zoomed in on the door. The "Do Not Disturb" sign went up immediately. That wasn't too unusual, but combined with everything else, it made me more suspicious. I kept one eye on the security feeds as I dug deeper into the guest records. The name he'd given, John Smith, was almost certainly fake. The credit card had gone through, but a quick search showed it had only been activated a week ago. As the night wore on, I grew more and more convinced that I had a killer staying in my hotel. But I still didn't have any concrete proof. I couldn't exactly go knocking on his door to check for bodies. Around 4 a.m., movement on the camera caught my eye. The man was leaving his room, carrying a large duffel bag. My heart started racing again. Where was he going at this hour? I watched as he made his way down to the parking lot and got into a beat-up old van. As he drove away, I managed to catch a glimpse of the license plate. I quickly wrote it down, hands shaking. As soon as he was gone, I made a decision. I had to call the police. Even if I was wrong, it was better to be safe than sorry. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "I need to report a possible sighting of the serial killer," I said when the operator answered. I gave them all the details, the man's description, the fake name, the van and license plate. The operator took it all seriously, saying they would send officers to check it out. They told me not to approach the suspect if he returned, but to call again immediately. The next hour was the longest of my life. I kept watching the cameras, jumping at every sound. What if he came back before the police arrived? What if he realized I was on to him? Finally, around 5:30 a.m., 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. 4 officers came inside, and I quickly filled them in on everything I'd seen and heard. They were just starting to look at the security footage when another car pulled in. The van was back. My heart leapt into my throat. The officers sprang into action, taking up positions around the lobby. Two of them slipped outside. I watched on the cameras as the man got out of the van, that same duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked even more nervous than before. As soon as he stepped into the lobby, the officers converged on him. "Freeze! Police!" one shouted. The man tried to run, but he was quickly tackled and handcuffed. Everything after that was a blur. More police arrived, and detectives, and even the FBI. They searched the man's room and van, though I wasn't told what they found. I gave statement after statement, recounting every detail of the night. It wasn't until late that afternoon that I finally learned the full story. The man was indeed the serial killer they'd been hunting. In his van, they found evidence linking him to at least 5 murders. If I hadn't recognized him and called it in, who knows how many more people might have died. The police chief personally thanked me for my keen observation and quick thinking. There was talk of a reward, even a medal of some kind. But honestly, I was just relieved it was over. That night was the most terrifying of my life, but I'm glad I trusted my instincts. I never thought my boring job as a night auditor would lead to catching a serial killer. It just goes to show you never know when you might be called upon to make a difference. I still work at the hotel, but things haven't quite been the same since that night. Every time the door opens, I find myself studying the guest's face, looking for anything suspicious. I know the chances of something like that happening again are slim to none, but the experience changed me. In a way, I'm grateful for what happened. It taught me to trust my gut, to pay attention to the little details. You never know when they might just save a life. Front desk. "How may I assist you?" I answered, expecting a routine request for extra towels or room service. Instead, I was met with silence. Then, a faint static, followed by what sounded like labored breathing. Before I could say anything else, the line went dead. Concerned, I decided to check on the room myself. Our record showed it was occupied by a Mr. Smith, who had checked in earlier that day. As I made my way up to the second floor, an inexplicable sense of unease crept over me. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows on the walls. I knocked on the door of 237, no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Using my master key, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was immaculate, almost untouched. The bed was made, no personal belongings in sight. It was as if no one had been there at all. But that couldn't be right. I distinctly remembered checking Mr. Smith and myself just hours ago. I checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed. No sign of Mr. Smith or his belongings. Puzzled and increasingly worried, I returned to the front desk and pulled up our security footage. The camera outside room 237 showed Mr. Smith entering his room at 7:43 p.m. He never came out. I fast-forwarded through hours of footage, but the door remained closed. No one entered or exited the room. My heart racing, I rewound the footage to the time of the mysterious phone call. What I saw next made my blood run cold. At exactly 11:17 p.m., the time of the call, there was a brief flicker in the hallway camera. For a split second, the image distorted, like a glitch in the matrix. When it cleared, something had changed. The Do Not Disturb sign that had been hanging on the doorknob of room 237 was gone. I replayed that moment over and over, my eyes glued to the screen. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. The sign had vanished into thin air, and with it, apparently, Mr. Smith. I spent the rest of my shift combing through every inch of the hotel. I checked every room, every closet, every nook and cranny where a person could possibly hide. Nothing. It was as if Mr. Smith had simply ceased to exist. By morning, I was exhausted and no closer to solving the mystery. I called the police, but they were skeptical. A middle-aged man checking into a hotel and then leaving without anyone noticing wasn't exactly a priority case for them. They took my statement, looked at the footage, and promised to look into it. Days passed, and there was no sign of Mr. Smith. No one came looking for him. No abandoned car was found in our parking lot. It was as if he had never existed at all. I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly inexplicable had happened that night. The image of that flickering hallway camera played on repeat in my mind. What had caused that glitch? And how could a person simply vanish without a trace? As the investigation stalled and life at the hotel returned to normal, I found myself unable to let it go. I started researching similar cases, diving deep into forums and conspiracy theories about people disappearing without a trace. Some of the stories I found chilled me to the bone. There were accounts of people vanishing in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens, yet leaving no trace behind. Stories of hotel guests checking in and never checking out, their rooms left in pristine condition as if they'd never been there. The more I read, the more I became convinced that what happened to Mr. Smith was part of something larger, something beyond our understanding. One night, about a week after the incident, I was alone at the front desk when the phone rang. It was coming from room 237. My hand trembled as I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice, distorted and distant, but unmistakably human. "Help," it said. "I'm still here." The line went dead. I raced up to room 237, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door, half expecting, half hoping to find Mr. Smith there. But the room was empty, just as it had been that first night. As I stood there trying to make sense of what was happening, I noticed something on the nightstand. It was a small silver object that I hadn't seen before. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was a cufflink. Engraved on its surface were the initials J.S., John Smith. I picked up the cufflink, turning it over in my hand. It was solid, real, tangible evidence that Mr. Smith had indeed been in this room. But how had it appeared now, a week later, in a room that had been thoroughly searched multiple times? The implications were staggering. If the cufflink could appear out of nowhere, what did that mean for Mr. Smith himself? Was he trapped somewhere, trying to reach out? Or had he slipped through some crack in reality, leaving only this small token behind? From that moment on, I became obsessed with room 237. I volunteered for every night shift, spending hours staring at the security footage, waiting for another glitch, another sign. I left voice recorders running in the room, hoping to catch some spectral whisper. I even started sleeping in the room next door, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Mr. Smith's presence. My colleagues thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that would shake the very foundations of what we believed to be possible. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no further sign of Mr. Smith. The police officially closed the case, citing lack of evidence of any crime. Life at the Oakwood Hotel went on as if nothing had ever happened. But I know the truth. I know that on that Tuesday night, something impossible occurred. A man vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a mystery that haunts me to this day. Every time I pass room 237, I can't help but wonder, is Mr. Smith still there somehow? Is he trying to reach out, trapped in some in-between place that we can't perceive? Or did he simply slip through a crack in our reality, never to be seen again? I don't have the answers. I'm not sure I ever will. But I know that I'll never stop looking. Because in this world of ours, where we think we have everything figured out, there are still mysteries that defy explanation. And the disappearance of Mr. Smith from room 237 is a chilling reminder that sometimes the impossible becomes possible, leaving us to question everything we thought we knew about the nature of our reality. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was starting my usual rounds on the 4th floor. As I approached room 412, I noticed the Do Not Disturb sign was still on the door, even though checkout time had passed an hour ago. I knocked gently and called out, "Housekeeping," but there was no response. After waiting another minute, I used my key card to enter. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The room was in complete disarray, clothes strewn about, drawers pulled open, curtains askew. At first I thought maybe the guests had just left in a hurry and made a mess, but then I noticed the empty space on the wall above the bed where a painting should have been. My heart started racing as I realized what I was looking at. The Belmont Grand is known for its collection of valuable artwork displayed throughout the hotel, including in the guest rooms. Each piece is carefully tracked and secured. A missing painting was a very big deal. I immediately radioed my supervisor, Maria, to report the situation. Within minutes, she arrived with the hotel manager, Mr. Reeves. They both looked grim as they surveyed the scene. Mr. Reeves ran his hand along the wall where the painting had been, revealing 4 small holes where it had been anchored. "This is bad," he muttered. "Very bad. That was an original Monet worth over $2 million. How could this have happened?" I felt sick to my stomach. In all my years working here, nothing like this had ever occurred. The Belmont prided itself on security and discretion. A theft of this magnitude would be devastating for the hotel's reputation. Mr. Reeves turned to me, his eyes narrowing. "Jenny, you're sure you didn't see anyone suspicious hanging around this room? No one carrying anything large or bulky?" I shook my head. "No, sir, nothing out of the ordinary. The guests in this room checked in 3 days ago. A couple, middle-aged, very polite. I cleaned their room yesterday morning and everything was normal then." He nodded, but I could tell he was still suspicious. I didn't blame him. A multi-million-dollar artwork doesn't just vanish into thin air. Someone had to have taken it, and the housekeeping staff would be the first suspects. As Maria and Mr. Reeves conferred in hushed tones, I started going through my mental checklist of everything I'd seen and done over the past few days. Had I missed something? Overlooked a clue? I prided myself on being observant, but now I was second-guessing every interaction. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the hallway. 2 police officers had arrived, along with a man in a sharp suit who introduced himself as Detective Harlow. They began questioning all of us about our movements and asking to see security camera footage. I recounted everything I could remember about the guests who had been staying in room 412. They had seemed so normal. The woman was blonde, always impeccably dressed. The man was balding, with wire-rimmed glasses. They'd smile and say good morning when I passed them in the hall. How could they have been art thieves? As the day wore on, the investigation intensified. More police arrived, dusting for fingerprints and taking photographs. Guests on the 4th floor were relocated as the entire level was treated as a crime scene. I was questioned multiple times, each session more intense than the last. By late afternoon, I was emotionally and physically drained. I'd been over every detail a dozen times, trying to recall any odd behavior or out-of-place items. My shift had ended hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to leave while the investigation was ongoing. I was sitting in the staff break room, nursing a cold cup of coffee, when Maria came in looking frazzled. "Jenny, I hate to ask, but can you do one last sweep of the fourth-floor rooms? The detectives want to make sure we haven't overlooked anything before they wrap up for the day." I nodded wearily and headed back upstairs. As I methodically checked each room, my mind was racing. Something about this whole situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. When I got to room 412 again, I paused in the doorway. The police had finished processing the scene, but it still felt eerie being back in there. I started my usual cleaning routine on autopilot, stripping the beds, wiping surfaces, checking drawers for left-behind items. As I ran the vacuum along the baseboard, I noticed a small nick in the wooden molding near the floor. It was barely visible, but something made me stop and take a closer look. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt a slight give. Heart pounding, I pressed gently and heard a soft click. To my utter shock, a hidden panel swung open in the wall, revealing a small compartment. And there, rolled up inside, was the missing Monet. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The painting hadn't been stolen at all. It was here the whole time. But why? Who would go to such elaborate lengths to hide it, only to leave it behind? With shaking hands, I called Mr. Reeves and Detective Harlow. Within minutes, they were examining the hidden compartment and the recovered artwork. Harlow's face was grim as he turned to address us. "This changes everything," he said. "It appears we're not dealing with a simple theft, but an elaborate insurance scam. The guests in this room were likely professional criminals who planned to claim the painting had been stolen, collect the insurance payout, and then retrieve it later to sell on the black market." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The Belmont hadn't failed in its security after all. But that relief was quickly replaced by a chill as I realized how close these criminals had come to getting away with their scheme. Over the next few hours, I watched in awe as the police pieced together what had happened. The couple who'd been staying in room 412 were actually well-known art thieves, wanted in multiple countries. They'd used fake IDs to check in and had planned every detail meticulously. Their mistake was underestimating the thoroughness of the hotel staff, namely me. If I hadn't noticed that tiny imperfection in the molding, who knows how long it would have been before the painting was discovered. As the night wore on, I gave my final statement to the police. Mr. Reeves pulled me aside, his earlier suspicion replaced with gratitude. "Jenny, I can't thank you enough," he said warmly. "Your attention to detail saved this hotel from financial ruin and a PR nightmare. I'd like to offer you a promotion to head of housekeeping, effective immediately." I was speechless. After the emotional roller coaster of the day, this unexpected recognition brought tears to my eyes. I accepted the offer, feeling a newfound pride in my work and my role at the Belmont. As I finally left the hotel in the early hours of the morning, I couldn't help but look at the grand old building in a new light. Its walls held so many secrets, some beautiful, some dangerous. But I felt honored to be one of its protectors, keeping watch over its treasures and its guests. The events of that day will stay with me forever. Whenever I pass room 412 now, I can't help but run my fingers along that section of molding, marveling at how such a small detail changed so many lives. It's a reminder that in this job and in life, the smallest things can often make the biggest difference. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. I was doing my usual rounds, walking past the service elevator on the 8th floor, when I saw a small package sitting in the hallway. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special, just a plain brown envelope. but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the way it was positioned, right in the middle of the hall. Or maybe it was just my gut instinct kicking in after years on the job. I picked up the envelope, turning it over in my hands. No name, no room number, nothing to indicate who it belonged to. That's when I made the decision that would set everything in motion. I decided to open it. Inside, I found a stack of photographs. As I flipped through them, my blood ran cold. These weren't just any photos. They were compromising shots of hotel guests in various states of undress or engaged in intimate acts. Some faces were clearly visible. Others were partially obscured but still recognizable. My mind was reeling. Who took these? Why were they here? I knew I had to report this immediately. But as I reached for my radio, a chill ran down my spine. What if whoever left this package was watching me right now? I glanced around nervously, suddenly feeling exposed in the empty hallway. I hurried back to the security office, clutching the envelope tightly. Once inside, I locked the door and started examining the photos more closely. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before, tiny notes scribbled on the back of each picture. Amounts of money, dates, and cryptic codes. It hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some pervert's collection. This was evidence of a blackmail operation. My mind was racing. How long had this been going on? How many guests had fallen victim to this scheme? And most importantly, who was behind it? I knew I needed to dig deeper, but I also knew I was way out of my depth. This was big, too big for just a hotel security guard to handle alone. I decided to start by reviewing the security footage from the past few hours, hoping to catch whoever had dropped off the package. As I scanned through the feeds, my heart nearly stopped. There, clear as day, was one of my co-workers, Jake, another security guard, placing the envelope in the hallway. I couldn't believe it. Jake had always seemed like a stand-up guy. We'd worked together for years, shared beers after shifts, even attended each other's barbecues. How could he be involved in something like this? I knew I had to confront him, but I needed to be smart about it. If Jake was part of this operation, who knows how deep it went or who else might be involved. I decided to wait until our shift change at 6 a.m. In the meantime, I made copies of all the evidence and hid them in my locker. Those next few hours were the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. When Jake finally showed up for the morning shift, I could barely look him in the eye. "Hey man, how was the night?" he asked casually, like nothing was wrong. I took a deep breath. "Jake, we need to talk, in private." His face changed instantly. It was subtle, but I saw it, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Sure, what's up?" he said, his voice a little too steady. I led him to the back office and closed the door. "I found something tonight," I said, pulling out the envelope. "Care to explain this?" Jake's face went pale. For a moment he just stared at the photos in my hand. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. We grappled for a few seconds, knocking over chairs and slamming into the wall. Jake was younger and fitter than me, but desperation gave me strength. I managed to pin him down, my knee on his chest. "Talk!" I shouted. "Who else is involved? How long has this been going on?" Jake's eyes darted around wildly. "You don't understand," he gasped. "They'll kill me if I talk. They'll kill my family." Before I could respond, the door burst open. 2 men in suits rushed in, guns drawn. "FBI!" one of them barked. "Everyone freeze!" The next few hours were a blur. I was questioned extensively about what I'd found and how I'd discovered the operation. It turned out the FBI had been investigating this blackmail ring for months. Jake was just a small part of it, a low-level operative tasked with collecting and distributing the photos. The real masterminds were much higher up the food chain. Hotel executives, corrupt cops, even a judge, all involved in this elaborate scheme to extort money from wealthy guests. They'd been using hidden cameras in rooms, hacking into personal devices, and employing a network of informants to gather compromising material. As the sun rose over the city, I sat in a police station, still trying to process everything that had happened. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained and vulnerable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The lead FBI agent, a stern-faced woman named Agent Chen, approached me. "You did good work tonight," she said, "but I need to warn you, this isn't over. The people behind this operation are powerful and resourceful. They won't take kindly to having their scheme exposed." Her words sent a chill through me. "What are you saying?" I asked, my mouth dry. "I'm saying you need to watch your back," she replied grimly. "We'll do our best to protect you, but you need to be vigilant. These people have eyes and ears everywhere." As if to emphasize her point, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know what you did. This isn't over." I felt the blood drain from my face. Agent Chen saw my reaction and quickly took my phone, barking orders to trace the number. But I knew it was useless. Whoever was behind this was always going to be one step ahead. The next few days were a nightmare. I was placed in protective custody, moved to a safe house on the outskirts of town. But nowhere felt safe anymore. Every car that drove by too slowly, every stranger that glanced my way, they all felt like potential threats. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The stress was taking its toll. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering if I should have just left that envelope alone. Maybe if I had, I'd still be living my normal life, blissfully unaware of the darkness lurking beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew I'd done the right thing. How many more people would have fallen victim to this scheme if it hadn't been exposed? How much more money would have been extorted? How many more lives ruined? A week after that fateful night, I was sitting in the safe house, staring out the window, when I saw a familiar face across the street. It was the mysterious informant who had captured me briefly before the police arrived. A man I'd only caught a glimpse of in the chaos. Our eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he was gone, vanishing into the crowd. I blinked, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the chill running down my spine told me it was all too real. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I realized something. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The blackmail operation might have been shut down, but the people behind it were still out there, and they hadn't forgotten about me. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. But I do know one thing. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unknow what I now know. The world is a darker, more dangerous place than I ever realized. And somehow, I've found myself right in the middle of it all. As I write this, I'm still in hiding, still looking over my shoulder. But I'm also determined to see this through, to make sure justice is served. Because if I don't, who will? So if you're reading this, be careful, be vigilant, because you never know when you might stumble upon something that will change your life forever. Just like I did on that ordinary Tuesday night shift that turned out to be anything but ordinary. They sat at the far end of the bar, away from the other patrons. I could tell right away something was off. The way they leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones, stealing furtive glances around the room. My gut twisted as I realized what I was witnessing. I tried to focus on my work, mixing drinks and chatting with the other guests, but I couldn't help glancing their way every few minutes. The man's wedding ring glinted under the soft bar lighting as he caressed the woman's hand. She giggled at something he said, playfully running her fingers up his arm. As the night wore on, their behavior grew increasingly brazen. Heated kisses, wandering hands beneath the bar top. I felt sick to my stomach. I'd seen my fair share of sketchy behavior working in hospitality, but something about this felt especially wrong. Maybe it was because I'd talked to the man before. He'd mentioned his wife and kids back home, how much he missed them during these long business trips. The cognitive dissonance of seeing him now all over this other woman made my head spin. I debated what to do. It wasn't really my place to intervene in guests' personal lives. But the thought of that unsuspecting wife and those innocent kids made my blood boil. I'd been cheated on before. I knew the gut-wrenching pain of betrayal. Could I really stand by and let it happen to someone else? After an hour of internal debate, I decided to at least try to say something. I made my way over to their end of the bar, pretending to wipe down the counter. "Can I get you folks anything else?" I asked casually. The man barely glanced my way. "We're fine, thanks." I hesitated, then pressed on. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but is everything all right?" I couldn't help but notice. He cut me off sharply. I said, "We're fine. Mind your own business." The woman shot me a cold glare. I retreated, face burning with embarrassment. So much for that approach. As my shift went on, I grew increasingly agitated. The couple got progressively drunker and handsy. At one point, I saw the man slip something into the woman's drink when she went to the bathroom. My alarm bells went into overdrive. I decided to alert my manager. Surely she'd want to know about potential illegal activity happening right under our noses. I found her in the back office and quickly explained the situation. To my shock, she seemed utterly uninterested. "That's a high-paying VIP guest," she said dismissively. "We don't get involved in their personal matters. Just keep serving drinks and ignore it." I was stunned. But what if he drugged her drink? Shouldn't we at least check on her? My manager's eyes narrowed. "Drop it, Jake. That's an order. Unless you want to be looking for a new job." I left her office in a daze, feeling completely helpless. Was I going crazy? How could everyone be so blasé about what was happening? When I returned to the bar, the couple was gone. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. What if something happened to that woman? What if the man's wife found out someday? The weight of my inaction crushed down on me. I finished my shift in a fog, barely registering the other patrons. As I was hanging up my apron to leave, I overheard two of the night clerks gossiping. "Did you see that couple from the bar earlier?" one asked. "They were all over each other in the elevator. Bet they're having a wild night up there." The other clerk laughed. "Oh yeah, I checked them in. Separate rooms, but I'm sure they're only using one. Hope the walls are soundproof." They cackled together, completely oblivious to my horrified expression. I hurried out of the hotel, desperate for fresh air. The cool night breeze did little to calm my racing thoughts. I kept seeing the man's wedding ring, imagining the pain on his wife's face if she knew. The woman's glazed eyes as she stumbled out of the bar, possibly drugged. My manager's cold indifference. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as scenarios played out in my head. Should I have done more? Said something to the woman directly? Called the police? Or was it really none of my business like everyone seemed to think? The next evening, I returned to work with a sense of dread. I scanned the bar anxiously, but there was no sign of the couple. Part of me was relieved, but another part worried about what might have happened. About an hour into my shift, the man appeared, alone this time, back in his usual spot with his laptop. He acted as if nothing had happened, ordering his usual whiskey without making eye contact. I felt a surge of anger as I prepared his drink. How dare he sit there so casually after what he'd done? I wanted to confront him, to shame him for his behavior, but I bit my tongue, remembering my manager's warning. As I set the whiskey in front of him, he finally looked up. For a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt? Regret? It vanished quickly, replaced by his usual aloof expression. "Thanks," he muttered, immediately turning back to his computer. I hesitated, then spoke softly. "Sir, about last night, I hope everything is okay. If you ever need someone to talk to..." He slammed his laptop shut, cutting me off. "I thought I told you to mind your own damn business," he hissed. "One more word and I'll have you fired." I backed away, hands raised in surrender. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." He glared at me for a long moment, then gathered his things and stormed out of the bar. I watched him go, a mixture of frustration and pity swirling in my chest. The rest of the week passed in a blur. I never saw the woman again. The man checked out a few days later without incident. Life at the hotel went on as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every time I saw a couple at the bar, I found myself scrutinizing their behavior. Was that really his wife? Were they hiding something sinister? The weight of suspicion and mistrust felt suffocating. I thought about quitting, finding a job where I wouldn't be forced to witness such morally ambiguous situations. But then I remembered all the good parts of my work, the interesting conversations, the grateful tourists I'd helped, the sense of community among my co-workers. Could I really give that all up? In the end, I decided to stay. But I made a promise to myself. I would trust my instincts more. I would find ways to help people without jeopardizing my job. And I would never again stand idly by while something felt wrong. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I'm more observant now, more attuned to the undercurrents of human interaction. I've learned that the world isn't black and white, that good people sometimes do bad things, and that being a bystander can be its own form of complicity. Most of all, I've realized the power and burden of bearing witness. Sometimes, simply seeing something and acknowledging its reality is an act of moral courage. Even if we can't always intervene directly, we carry those truths with us. And in carrying them, we have a responsibility to be better, to do better, in whatever ways we can. I still think about that couple sometimes. I hope they found peace, in whatever form that might take. And I hope that someday, if I'm ever on the other side of that bar, someone will care enough to notice if something's not right. Because in the end, that's all any of us can really ask for. To be seen, to be cared about, even by a stranger. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from around the corner. At first I thought it might be a guest's dog or something, but as I got closer, I realized it was the sound of a child crying. My heart started racing immediately. What was a kid doing wandering the halls at this hour? I quickened my pace and turned the corner. And there she was, a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, standing all alone in her pajamas. She had messy blonde hair and was clutching a stuffed rabbit, tears streaming down her face. When she saw me, she looked up with these big, scared blue eyes that just broke my heart. "Hey there, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and gentle. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" The little girl just sniffled and shook her head, hugging her rabbit tighter. I knelt down to her level, my mind racing. How long had she been out here alone? Where the hell were her parents? "My name's Alex," I told her. "I work here at the hotel. Can you tell me your name?" "Emily," she said in a tiny voice. "Okay, Emily. Don't worry. We're going to find your mom and dad. Do you remember what room you're staying in?" She shook her head again. "Great." I pulled out my work phone and called down to the front desk. "Hey, it's Alex up on 14. I've got a lost child up here. Little girl named Emily. Can you check the guest registry and see if we have any families with a daughter by that name?" While they looked into it, I tried to comfort Emily and figure out more. "Emily, honey, did you walk out of your room by yourself? Or did you get separated from your parents somewhere else in the hotel?" "I woke up and Mommy and Daddy were gone," she said, lower lip trembling. "I got scared and went to look for them." Jesus, what kind of parents leave their kid alone in a hotel room in the middle of the night? I was starting to get a bad feeling about this whole situation. The front desk got back to me. They had an Emily Johnson registered with her parents in room 1423. I thanked them and hung up, then turned back to the little girl. "Okay, Emily, I think I know where your room is. Let's go check and see if your parents are back, all right?" She nodded and reached up to take my hand as we walked down the hall. My heart ached for this poor kid. When we got to 1423, I knocked loudly on the door. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, hello? Anyone there?" No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Emily was looking more and more anxious. I used my master key to open the door, calling out as I did so. "Hello, it's hotel staff. Just checking to make sure everything's all right." The room was dark and messy. Empty beer bottles and mini liquor containers from the minibar were scattered around. I flipped on the lights, and my stomach dropped. 2 adults, presumably Emily's parents, were passed out cold. The man was sprawled across the bed, snoring loudly. The woman was slumped in an armchair, an empty wine bottle on the floor beside her. I turned to Emily, trying to shield her view. "Why don't you wait right here by the door for a second, sweetie? I'm just going to check on your mom and dad." I hurried over to the couple, my blood boiling. I shook the man's shoulder roughly. Sir, wake up." He groaned and blinked blearily at me. "What? Who the hell are you?" "Hotel staff, sir. Your daughter was wandering the halls alone. She could have been hurt or worse. What were you thinking leaving her by herself?" That seemed to jolt him awake a bit. He sat up, looking disoriented. "Emily? Where's Emily?" "She's right here, no thanks to you," I said coldly, gesturing to where she stood by the door. He stumbled to his feet, nearly falling over. The woman in the chair stirred at the commotion. "Oh God, Emily, baby, come here," the man slurred, stumbling towards her. Emily shrank back, clinging to my leg. My protective instincts flared. "Sir, please stay back. You're clearly intoxicated. I'm going to have to report this incident to hotel management and possibly the authorities." No, please," the woman spoke up, her words slightly slurred. "We just had a few drinks after she fell asleep. We didn't mean any harm." I bit back an angry retort. These people were so cavalier about endangering their child. I knelt down to Emily's level again. "Emily, do you feel safe staying here with your parents tonight?" She hesitated, looking uncertain. That was enough for me. "I'm sorry, but given the circumstances, I don't think it's appropriate for Emily to remain in your care right now. I'm going to have to insist she come with me while we sort this out." The parents protested, but they were in no state to argue. I scooped Emily up and carried her out of the room. My coworker Lisa from the front desk arrived to help manage the situation. We took Emily down to a secure staff area and got her some milk and cookies while we figured out next steps. I sat with her, my heart breaking as she quietly munched her cookies. "You were really brave tonight, Emily," I told her gently. "I'm sorry you got scared, but you did the right thing finding someone to help." She gave me a small smile. "Thank you for finding me, Alex." I had to blink back tears. This sweet little girl deserved so much better. Hotel management got involved, and after some discussion, it was decided that Emily would stay in a separate room under staff supervision for the night. Her parents were informed they'd need to meet with the hotel manager in the morning to discuss the incident before being allowed to check out. I volunteered to stay with Emily, unable to bear the thought of leaving her with strangers after her ordeal. We made a cozy fort out of blankets and pillows, and I read her stories until she drifted off to sleep. As I watched over her, I couldn't stop thinking about how differently this night could have gone. If I hadn't found her, who knows what could have happened to this innocent child. The fact that her own parents put her in such danger made me furious. The next morning, I gave my statement to the manager and Child Protective Services. Emily's parents were appropriately contrite and remorseful in the light of day, but I still struggled to forgive their negligence. Before they left, Emily ran over to give me a big hug. "Bye, Alex. Thank you for rescuing me." I hugged her back tightly, wishing I could do more to protect her. "You take care, sweetheart. Remember, you can always ask for help if you need it, okay?" As I watched them drive away, I felt a mix of emotions: relief that Emily was safe, anger at her parents, and a lingering worry for her future. That night changed me. It opened my eyes to the vulnerability of children and the grave responsibility we all have to look out for them. I'll never forget Emily and that harrowing night. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under the bed or in the closet. They're the ones who are supposed to keep you safe. I can only hope that her parents learned their lesson and that Emily will be okay. But I'll always wonder about her, that brave little girl lost in the night, and hope that she found the love and protection she deserves. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the call. I had just settled into the break room for a quick coffee, hoping to make it through the last few hours of my graveyard shift without incident. The shrill ring of the emergency line shattered the silence, making me jump and nearly spill my drink. "Maintenance, this is Mike," I answered, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. "Mike, we need you up in room 412 immediately." The night manager's voice crackled through the receiver, tense and urgent. "Guest reported a burst pipe, water everywhere. Get up there now." I sighed, setting down my mug and grabbing my tool belt. Just another night in paradise, I thought to myself as I headed for the elevator. The fourth floor was eerily quiet as I stepped out, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, the numbers on the doors a blur until I reached 412. I knocked firmly, announcing myself. "Maintenance, I'm here about the leak." No response. I frowned, knocking again. Still nothing. With a growing sense of unease, I used my master key to unlock the door and cautiously pushed it open. "Hello? Maintenance here. Is everyone all right?" The room was dark, save for a sliver of light spilling from beneath the bathroom door. I flicked on the main lights, blinking as my eyes adjusted. That's when I saw him. A man was sprawled face down on the floor near the bed, motionless. My heart leaped into my throat as I rushed over, kneeling beside him. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" I gently rolled him onto his side, checking for breathing. To my relief, he was alive, but barely conscious. A nasty gash on his forehead was bleeding profusely, and his eyes were unfocused as they met mine. "Help," he managed to croak out, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're still." Before he could finish, a muffled thud from the bathroom made me freeze. My blood ran cold as I realized we weren't alone. I helped the injured man to a sitting position, propping him against the bed. "Stay here," I whispered, my mind racing. "I'm going to call for help." I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking as I tried to key in the emergency code. But before I could press the button, the bathroom door burst open. Two men in dark clothing barreled out, their faces hidden behind ski masks. One brandished a crowbar, the other a wicked-looking knife. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as terror gripped me. "Well, well," the one with the knife sneered, his eyes glinting dangerously in the lamplight. "Looks like we've got company." His partner laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent chills down my spine. "Guess we'll have to take care of this one, too." In that moment, time seemed to slow down. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat breaking out across my skin. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a fierce primal instinct to protect. I glanced at the injured man slumped against the bed, then back at the intruders. I knew I was all that stood between them and whatever twisted plans they had in mind. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I raised my hands. "I don't want any trouble. Just take what you want and go. No one needs to get hurt." The man with the crowbar took a menacing step forward. "Oh, but someone's already hurt, ain't they? And we can't have any witnesses." As he lunged towards me, time snapped back into focus. I dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the swing of the crowbar. It crashed into the nearby dresser, sending splinters of wood flying. In a burst of desperate energy, I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy lamp from the bedside table. As the crowbar-wielding attacker turned to face me again, I swung with all my might. The lamp connected with a sickening crack, and the man staggered backward, dropping his weapon. His partner let out an enraged yell and charged at me, knife glinting in the light. I ducked under his wild swing, my maintenance instincts kicking in. In one fluid motion, I scooped up the fallen crowbar and brought it up just in time to deflect another knife thrust. The clash of metal on metal rang out, and I could feel the force of the impact reverberating up my arm. But adrenaline was coursing through me now, sharpening my senses and dulling the fear. We grappled for what felt like an eternity, a deadly dance of strikes and parries. I managed to land a solid hit on the knife wielder's arm, causing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. But his partner had recovered, and I soon found myself facing both of them again. I was outnumbered and outmatched, my brief surge of courage quickly giving way to despair. Just as I thought it was all over, a miracle happened. The shrill wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing louder by the second. The two intruders exchanged panicked glances. "Shit, we gotta go," one of them hissed. They made a break for the balcony, shoving past me in their haste. I stumbled, but managed to stay on my feet, watching in disbelief as they rappelled down the side of the building with practiced ease. As their dark figures disappeared into the night, I sagged against the wall, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. The adrenaline began to ebb, leaving me shaking and nauseous. I looked over at the injured guest, who was now fully conscious and staring at me with a mixture of gratitude and shock. You saved my life," he said hoarsely. Before I could respond, the room erupted into chaos. Police officers and hotel security burst in, weapons drawn. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and medical examinations. It turned out that the guest, a wealthy businessman, had surprised the burglars in the middle of their heist. They had attacked him and were in the process of clearing out the room when I arrived. My burst pipe call had actually been a silent alarm triggered by the guest before he was knocked unconscious. The night manager, realizing something was amiss when I didn't report back, had called the police. In the days that followed, I was hailed as a hero by the hotel and local media. The two burglars were caught a week later trying to fence some of the stolen goods. But even as life returned to normal, I found myself forever changed by that night. Every creak in the darkness, every unexpected sound now sets my heart racing. I've replayed those terrifying moments in my mind countless times, wondering what might have happened if I'd made different choices. But mostly, I'm just grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful that I was able to help someone in need, and grateful for the reminder of how precious and fragile life can be. So if you're ever staying in a hotel and see a tired-looking maintenance worker shuffling down the hallway, give them a smile and a nod. You never know. They might just be the unsung hero who'd risk everything to keep you safe. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed something odd. The computer was acting sluggish, taking forever to load simple screens. I figured it was just another glitch in our outdated system and tried rebooting. That's when I saw it, a brief flash of unfamiliar code scrolling across the screen before it went dark. My stomach dropped. In that moment, I knew something was very wrong. With shaking hands, I called our IT manager, praying he'd pick up despite the ungodly hour. "Hello?" came a groggy voice after several rings. "Mark, it's John from the front desk. I think we're under attack." There was a pause, then, "What do you mean under attack?" I quickly explained what I'd seen. To his credit, Mark snapped to attention immediately. "Don't touch anything else. I'm on my way." The next 30 minutes were excruciating. I paced the lobby, jumping at every little sound. What if whoever was behind this decided to show up in person? I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mark burst through the doors at 2:45, laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He looked as frazzled as I felt. "Show me everything," he demanded, making a beeline for the computers. I walked him through what had happened, watching anxiously as his fingers flew over the keyboard. His expression grew increasingly grim. "This is bad, John. Really bad. They're already deep in our system." My heart sank. What does that mean? What can they access? Mark's eyes met mine, full of worry. Everything. Guest records, credit card info, staff data. It's all vulnerable. The implications hit me like a ton of bricks. Thousands of people's personal information exposed. The damage to the hotel's reputation would be catastrophic. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "We fight back," Mark said grimly. "But I can't do it alone. We need to call in reinforcements." For the next hour, Mark was on the phone, rallying our entire IT team. One by one, they trickled in, looking tired but determined. Soon the lobby was transformed into a makeshift command center with laptops and cords strewn everywhere. I felt helpless, watching them work their technological magic. Lines of code I couldn't begin to understand flashed across their screens. The tension in the room was palpable. "They're trying to exfiltrate the data," one of the techs announced. "We need to shut down the servers now. If we do that, we lose our chance to trace them," another argued. "We don't have a choice," Mark cut in. "Protecting the data has to be our priority." I watched as they executed a series of commands, effectively severing our connection to the outside world. The quiet that followed was eerie. "Did it work?" I asked hesitantly. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "For now, but they'll be back. This is just round one. He wasn't wrong. Over the next several hours, we weathered wave after wave of attacks. The hackers were relentless, probing for any weakness in our defenses. It felt like being under siege. I did what I could to help, fetching coffee, relaying messages, anything to feel useful. But mostly, I worried. What if we couldn't stop them? The faces of our guests flashed through my mind. Families on vacation, business travelers, honeymooners. They trusted us with their information. The thought of letting them down was unbearable. As dawn approached, the attacks intensified. The team was visibly flagging, fueled only by caffeine and determination. "They're changing tactics," one of the techs announced, voice tight with stress. "This is like nothing I've ever seen before." I watched Mark's face, searching for any sign of hope. He looked exhausted, but there was a glint of steel in his eyes. "Neither have they," he said firmly. "We've got something they don't, home field advantage. This is our system, our hotel. We know it better than anyone." His words seemed to energize the team. They attacked the problem with renewed vigor, calling out to each other in a language of acronyms and technical jargon I could barely follow. And then, suddenly, there was a shift. The frantic keyboard clicking slowed. The tension in the air changed. "Wait," one of the younger techs said, leaning in close to her screen. I think we've got them." A hush fell over the room. We all held our breath, afraid to jinx it. "She's right," Mark confirmed after a moment, his voice full of disbelief. "We've isolated their entry point. They're scrambling." What followed was a blur of activity as the team worked to seal off every possible avenue of attack. I watched in awe as they systematically shut down the invasion, locking the hackers out for good. When it was finally over, the silence was deafening. We all looked at each other, shell-shocked and exhausted. "Is it really done?" I asked cautiously. Mark nodded, a tired smile spreading across his face. "It's done. We did it." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. I felt like I could finally breathe again. As the team began the process of bringing our systems safely back online, I stepped outside for some air. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. It was beautiful, made even more so by the knowledge of what we'd just been through. Back inside, the mood was cautiously celebratory. We'd done it. We'd protected our guests, our hotel, our reputation. But the experience had shaken us all. "We got lucky this time," Mark said soberly as we debriefed. "But this is the new reality. We need to be prepared for next time." I nodded, knowing he was right. The world had changed, and we needed to change with it. As I finally clocked out that morning, I felt a mix of emotions I'd never experienced before. Exhaustion, yes, but also pride. Fear for what the future might hold, but determination to face it head on. One thing was certain, I'd never look at my job the same way again. The night audit might seem boring to some, but I now knew the truth. We were the first line of defense, standing guard while the rest of the world slept. I drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. Part of me wondered if it had all been some crazy dream. But the bone-deep weariness and the lingering adrenaline told me otherwise. As I crawled into bed, I found myself already dreading my next shift. What new challenges would it bring? But I also felt a strange sense of anticipation. We'd face the worst and come out on top. Whatever came next, I knew we'd be ready. I drifted off to sleep, my dreams filled with scrolling code and shadowy figures. But even in sleep, a part of me remained vigilant. The night auditor, always on guard. I was just a regular hotel manager, going about my day-to-day routine of overseeing operations, handling guest complaints, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Little did I know that my world was about to be turned upside down in a way I never could have imagined. It started as a typical Tuesday morning. I arrived at the Pinewood Hotel, our quaint 50-room property nestled in the heart of a charming small town, ready to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. As I walked through the lobby, greeting the staff and guests with my usual cheerful demeanor, I noticed an unusual tension in the air. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I made my way to my office, settling in with a cup of coffee to check my emails. That's when I saw it, an urgent message from our owner, Mr. Thompson. My heart sank as I read the contents. A large hotel chain, Greedy Corp Hotels, was attempting a hostile takeover of our beloved Pinewood. They were offering an astronomical sum to buy out Mr. Thompson, and he was seriously considering it. My mind raced with the implications. If Greedy Corp took over, they'd likely gut our staff, replacing most of us with their own people. The charm and personal touch that made Pinewood special would be lost, replaced by cookie-cutter corporate policies. Our loyal guests, many of whom had been coming for years and felt like family, would no longer have the experience they'd grown to love. I couldn't let this happen. Not to our staff, not to our guests, and not to this town that relied on Pinewood as a cornerstone of its economy. But what could I, a simple hotel manager, do against a corporate giant? As I sat there, feeling overwhelmed and defeated, a knock on my door jolted me back to reality. It was Lisa, our head of housekeeping, with a concerned look on her face. "Is everything okay, boss? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to share the news, but I realized that if we were going to have any chance of fighting this, I'd need the support of the entire team. Taking a deep breath, I filled Lisa in on the situation. Her reaction surprised me. Instead of panic, I saw determination in her eyes. "We can't let them take our home away from us," she said firmly. "What can we do to stop this?" That's when it hit me. We weren't powerless. We had something Greedy Corp could never buy, the loyalty and love of our staff and guests. If we could mobilize that, maybe, just maybe, we stood a chance. Over the next few hours, word spread through the hotel like wildfire. I called an emergency staff meeting, explaining the situation to everyone. The response was unanimous. They were ready to fight for Pinewood. We quickly formed a plan. Each department would reach out to the guests they had the closest relationships with, explaining the situation and asking for their support. The maintenance team, led by old Joe, who'd been with us for 30 years, started compiling data on all the unique, historical features of the hotel that would likely be lost in a corporate takeover. Our marketing team, though small, began crafting a social media campaign to rally community support. As for me, I had the most daunting task of all. I needed to convince Mr. Thompson not to sell. I spent hours poring over financial records, guest satisfaction scores, and local economic impact reports. I was determined to show him that Pinewood was worth more than just the hefty price tag Greedy Corp was offering. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I barely slept, fueled by adrenaline and countless cups of coffee. Our guests, upon hearing the news, rallied around us in a way I never expected. Many of them took to social media, sharing stories of their experiences at Pinewood and why it was so special. Some even offered to contribute financially to help us fight the takeover. The local community got involved too. The mayor, realizing the potential economic impact of losing Pinewood's unique draw, pledged his support. Local businesses, many of which benefited from the tourism Pinewood brought in, joined our cause. But Greedy Corp wasn't going down without a fight. They increased their offer, trying to tempt Mr. Thompson with even more money. They sent representatives to town, attempting to sway public opinion with promises of modernization and improved efficiency. The pressure was immense. There were moments when I thought about giving up, about accepting the inevitable. But then I'd look at the determination on the faces of our staff, read another heartfelt message from a guest, and find the strength to keep going. The turning point came about a week into our battle. I was in my office preparing for yet another call with Mr. Thompson when Lisa burst in. "Boss, you need to see this," she exclaimed, practically dragging me to the lobby. What I saw took my breath away. The lobby was filled with people, staff, guests, and local residents alike. They were holding handmade signs with messages like "Save Pinewood" and "Community over corporations." As I stood there, stunned, they began to chant my name. Overwhelmed with emotion, I addressed the crowd. I thanked them for their support and promised that we wouldn't give up without a fight. The energy in that room was electric, and I knew at that moment that we had a real chance. Armed with this show of support, I went into my call with Mr. Thompson with renewed vigor. I presented him with all the data I'd gathered, the financial projections showing long-term stability, and most importantly, evidence of the immense community support we had. To my surprise and relief, Mr. Thompson listened intently. He admitted that he'd been swayed by the large sum Greedy Corp was offering, but seeing the passion and dedication of the staff and community had made him reconsider. After a long pause that felt like an eternity, he made his decision. Pinewood would not be sold. The celebration that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The entire town seemed to rejoice. We threw a massive party in the hotel, with staff, guests, and locals all coming together to celebrate our victory. In the aftermath of our successful defense, Pinewood flourished like never before. Our story had gained national attention, drawing in new guests curious to experience the hotel that had fought off a corporate giant. But more importantly, it strengthened our bonds with our loyal guests and the local community. Looking back on that intense period, I'm still amazed at what we accomplished. It taught me the true power of community, dedication, and standing up for what you believe in. Pinewood wasn't just a hotel, it was a home, a family, and a vital part of our town's identity. And together, we had ensured it would remain that way for years to come. As I sit in my office now, looking out at the bustling lobby, I can't help but smile. The Pinewood Hotel stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, the little guys can win. And that's a story worth telling. I've been a chef for over a decade now, and I've seen my fair share of kitchen drama. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last month. It all started when we hired a new line cook, Jake. At first, he seemed like a great addition to the team, skilled, efficient, always cracking jokes. But it didn't take long for things to take a dark turn. It was a busy Friday night, and the kitchen was in full swing. I was plating a delicate sea bass dish when I felt someone brush up against me from behind. I turned, expecting to see one of the servers squeezing past, but it was Jake. He was standing way too close, a sly grin on his face. "Sorry, chef," he said, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I brushed it off as an accident and got back to work. But over the next few days, I started noticing a pattern. Jake always seemed to find reasons to be in my personal space. He'd reach around me to grab utensils, even when there was plenty of room to go around. He'd accidentally bump into me multiple times during a shift. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was just clumsy or unaware of personal boundaries. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Things escalated about a week later. I was in the walk-in fridge, doing inventory, when Jake came in. He closed the door behind him, blocking my exit. "Need any help, chef?" he asked, his eyes roaming over my body in a way that made me feel naked and exposed. I stammered out a no and tried to squeeze past him, but he put his hand on my waist. "Are you sure? I'd be happy to give you a hand. Or two." His voice was low, predatory. I felt my heart racing, a cold sweat breaking out despite the chill of the fridge. I managed to push past him and practically ran out of the walk-in. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my clipboard. I wanted to scream, to tell someone what had just happened, but I felt paralyzed. What if no one believed me? What if they thought I was overreacting? I've worked so hard to get where I am in this male-dominated industry. Would speaking up jeopardize everything I've built? For the next few days, I tried my best to avoid Jake. I rearranged schedules so we wouldn't be working the same stations. I made sure I was never alone in the kitchen, but it was like he could sense my fear, and it only made him bolder. He'd make lewd comments just loud enough for me to hear, but not loud enough for anyone else to notice. He'd find excuses to touch me, a hand on my lower back as he passed, fingers brushing mine as he handed me a knife. I started dreading coming to work. The kitchen that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I heard footsteps behind me, I'd tense up, afraid it was Jake. I knew I had to do something, but the thought of confronting him terrified me. Finally, after a particularly bad shift where Jake had cornered me in the dry storage and tried to kiss me, I decided enough was enough. I gathered all my courage and asked to speak with him privately after service. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest as I waited for him in the empty dining room. When Jake arrived, he had that same smug grin on his face. "Finally coming around, chef," he said, reaching out to touch my face. I stepped back, my voice shaking as I told him in no uncertain terms that his behavior was unacceptable. I told him about the discomfort and fear he'd been causing me, how his actions were affecting my work and my well-being. For a moment, Jake looked stunned. Then his expression darkened. "You're overreacting," he spat. "I was just being friendly. Maybe if you weren't such a frigid bitch, you'd appreciate the attention." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Who do you think they'll believe anyway? The neurotic chef who can't take a joke, or the new guy everyone loves?" I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All my fears about not being believed came rushing back, but something in me snapped. I was done being afraid. "They'll believe me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "because I'm not the only one you've been harassing, and I'm not going to stay quiet anymore." I turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there with his mouth hanging open. The next morning, I went straight to the restaurant owner's office. My hands were shaking as I recounted everything that had happened over the past few weeks. To my immense relief, she listened without interruption, her face growing more concerned with each detail I shared. When I finished, she thanked me for coming forward and assured me that she would take immediate action. True to her word, by the end of the day, Jake had been called into a meeting with HR and the owner. He was escorted out of the building less than an hour later, terminated on the spot. The relief I felt was indescribable. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The kitchen felt like home again. In the days that followed, 2 other staff members came forward with their own stories about Jake's inappropriate behavior. Knowing that I had potentially prevented others from going through what I did made me feel like I'd done the right thing, despite how terrifying it had been. The owner implemented new training programs on workplace harassment and made it clear that any form of inappropriate behavior would not be tolerated. She thanked me again for having the courage to speak up, saying that my actions had made the restaurant a safer place for everyone. It's been a month now, and things are finally starting to feel normal again. There are still moments when I tense up if someone comes up behind me unexpectedly, but those reactions are becoming less frequent. I'm sleeping better, enjoying my work again, and most importantly, I feel empowered. I stood up for myself and made a difference. I know not every story like this has a happy ending. I'm incredibly fortunate to have had such a supportive management team, but I hope that by sharing my experience, I can encourage others who might be going through something similar to speak up. You're not alone, and you don't have to suffer in silence. Your safety and well-being matter. To anyone reading this who might be experiencing workplace harassment, document everything, confide in someone you trust, and don't be afraid to report it. It's scary, I know, but you deserve to feel safe and respected at work. And to those in positions of power, listen to your employees when they come to you with concerns. Create an environment where people feel safe speaking up, because no one should have to go through what I did just to do their job. Looking back, I'm proud of myself for finding the strength to confront Jake and report him. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, but in the end, I reclaimed my power and my peace of mind, and that's worth more than any fear or discomfort I had to push through to get here. As I tied on my apron this morning, ready to start another day in the kitchen, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: excitement. The sizzle of pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the controlled chaos of a busy service, all the things I love about being a chef. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again, and that feeling, it's absolutely priceless. I was leaning against one of the pillars near the entrance, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Suddenly, I heard the screech of tires and looked up just in time to see a car swerving erratically down the street. Before I could even process what was happening, there was a sickening thud as the car struck someone crossing the road. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw a body go flying through the air, landing in a crumpled heap on the pavement about 20 feet away. The car screeched to a brief halt, then peeled away, tires squealing as it sped off into the night. For a split second, I stood frozen in shock. Then instinct and adrenaline kicked in and I sprinted towards the victim. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, probably in her 30s. She was lying motionless, blood pooling around her head. Oh God, I muttered, my hands shaking as I knelt beside her. I'd taken a basic first aid course as part of my job training, but I never thought I'd actually need to use it like this. I carefully felt for a pulse on her neck, relief washing over me when I detected a faint throb. She was alive, at least for now. I yelled back towards the hotel entrance, "Someone call 911, there's been an accident." Then I turned my attention back to the woman. She had a nasty gash on her forehead, and her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. I was afraid to move her in case of spinal injuries. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I asked, my voice quavering. "Help is on the way. Just try to stay still." There was no response, but I kept talking, hoping my voice might somehow anchor her to consciousness. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered. The night manager rushed out with the first aid kit. "What happened?" he demanded. "Hit and run," I explained tersely, taking the kit from him. "I saw it all. We need to keep her stable until the ambulance arrives." I opened the kit with trembling hands, pulling out gauze pads to try to staunch the bleeding from her head wound. The next few minutes were a blur as I worked to keep pressure on the wound while monitoring her breathing. Every second felt like an eternity as we waited for the ambulance to arrive. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. The paramedics arrived and quickly took over, their practiced movements making me acutely aware of how out of my depth I'd been. As they loaded the woman onto a stretcher, one of them turned to me. "You did good, kid," he said. "Keeping her still and controlling that bleeding may have saved her life." I nodded numbly, suddenly feeling lightheaded as the adrenaline began to wear off. That's when I noticed the police cars that had arrived on the scene. An officer approached me, notebook in hand. "You witnessed the accident?" he asked. Yes," I stammered. "I saw everything." The next hour was a whirlwind of questions as I recounted every detail I could remember about the car and the incident. The make, model, color, even a partial license plate that I'd managed to glimpse as it sped away. "This is extremely helpful," the officer said. "We'll put out an APB right away." As the night wore on, I found myself unable to leave. I kept replaying the accident in my mind, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently. The hotel manager told me to go home, that I'd done more than enough, but I couldn't bring myself to leave until I knew the woman's fate. It was nearly 3 a.m. when we finally got word from the hospital. The woman, whose name I learned was Emily, had survived surgery and was in critical but stable condition. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but the night wasn't over yet. Around 4 a.m., there was a commotion as police cars pulled up to the hotel again. This time, they had the hit-and-run driver in custody. Apparently, they'd found him at a bar about 10 miles away, still visibly intoxicated. The officer who had taken my statement earlier approached me again. "We got him," he said. "Your description was spot on. The car had damage consistent with the accident, and his blood alcohol level was well over the legal limit." I felt a mix of emotions, relief that the driver had been caught, anger at his recklessness, and a lingering anxiety about Emily's condition. The officer must have sensed my turmoil. "You did everything right tonight," he assured me. "Your quick action and detailed observation may have saved a life and helped us catch a dangerous driver. You should be proud." As the sun began to rise, casting a surreal glow over the scene of the accident, I finally allowed myself to go home. But sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the accident replaying in vivid detail. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly checking for updates on Emily's condition. The hotel received flowers and a heartfelt note from her family, thanking the staff, and me specifically, for our quick action. A week later, I was called to give a formal statement at the police station. The case against the driver was strong, thanks in large part to my eyewitness account. As I recounted the events once again, I was struck by how differently the night could have ended if I hadn't been there, or if I'd hesitated even a moment longer. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself more alert, more aware of my surroundings. I've signed up for advanced first aid courses, determined to be better prepared if something like this ever happens again. But most of all, I'm haunted by the fragility of life, how a single moment, a single decision can alter everything. Every time I see headlights approaching too fast or hear the screech of brakes, My heart races. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of that impact, or the sight of Emily's broken body on the pavement. Yet amidst the trauma and anxiety, there's also a sense of purpose. I know now that I'm capable of acting under pressure, of making a difference when it really counts. It's a responsibility I never asked for, but one I now carry with me every day. As I stand at my post each night, I'm no longer just waiting for the next car to park. I'm watching, ready to spring into action if needed. Because I've learned that sometimes being in the right place at the right time and having the courage to act can make all the difference in the world. I had been working as a housekeeper at the Overlook Hotel for almost 2 years when it happened. The hotel itself was old and imposing, with long, winding corridors and an atmosphere that always felt a bit off. But I needed the job, so I tried not to let it get to me. That day started like any other. I arrived for my shift at 7 a.m., changed into my uniform, and began my usual rounds. The hotel was fairly quiet, being the off-season, with only a handful of guests staying. I made my way through the rooms on the second floor, cleaning and restocking as I went. It was around 10 a.m. when I first noticed him. I was pushing my cart down the hallway of the third floor when I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced behind me and saw a man standing at the far end of the corridor. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark suit that seemed out of place for a hotel guest. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his eyes fixed on me. I quickly looked away and kept walking, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when I reached the next room and looked back, he was still there, unmoved. A chill ran through me. I hurried into the room and shut the door, my hands shaking slightly as I started to clean. When I emerged 20 minutes later, the hallway was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But as I moved to the next room, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. The man, turning a corner at the end of the hall. My heart started racing. Was he following me? I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I stepped into the hallway, I'd see him, always at a distance, always watching. Sometimes he'd be at the end of a corridor. Other times I'd catch his reflection in a mirror or see his shadow beneath a door. But whenever I turned to look directly, he'd vanish. By early afternoon, I was a nervous wreck. I hadn't been able to clean properly, jumping at every little sound. I considered telling my supervisor, but what would I say? That I was being stalked by a guest who disappeared every time I tried to get a good look at him? I'd sound crazy. I decided to take my lunch break early, hoping some food would calm my nerves. As I made my way to the staff room, I rounded a corner and nearly collided with him. He was standing right there, blocking my path, his face still obscured in shadow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. Excuse me," I stammered, trying to step around him. But he moved with me, staying in front of me. I could smell him now, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice a low rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "That's not very polite." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My throat felt tight with fear. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, "for so long, and now you're here." I shook my head, confusion mixing with my terror. I don't know what you're talking about," I managed to say. He laughed then, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to echo in the empty hallway. "Oh, but you do. Deep down, you know exactly who I am. You've always known." My back hit the wall, and I realized with horror that I was trapped. He reached out a pale, bony hand towards my face. I could see his eyes now, sunken and gleaming with an unnatural light. "Don't touch me," I screamed, ducking under his arm and running blindly down the hall. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps unnaturally fast. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I burst through the door to the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time. I glanced back and saw him at the top of the stairs, his face finally visible. It was gaunt and corpse-like, with skin stretched tight over prominent bones. His mouth was open in a silent scream, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. I nearly fell in my haste to get away, my legs weak with fear. I reached the ground floor and ran through the lobby, ignoring the startled looks from guests and staff. I didn't stop until I was in my car, doors locked, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of him standing at the hotel entrance, watching me go. His form seemed to flicker and distort, like a bad TV signal. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from what had happened. I called my supervisor as soon as I got home and quit on the spot. I couldn't bring myself to explain why. I just knew I could never set foot in that hotel again. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that day. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just stress or an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can smell that sickly sweet odor, and in the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of a tall, thin figure watching me from the shadows. I don't know who or what that man was, or why he seemed to know me. All I know is that I narrowly escaped something truly horrifying that day, and the memory of it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Even writing this, my hands are shaking, and I keep glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for me. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. The encounter in that hotel changed me fundamentally. I'm constantly on edge, always watching for signs of the unexplainable. I've become a different person, jumpier, more paranoid. I've lost friends who couldn't understand why I've changed so much. How could I explain to them what I can barely understand myself? Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll catch a whiff of that distinct odor, or see a tall figure in a suit out of the corner of my eye, and the terror comes rushing back. I've moved twice since that day, always feeling like I'm being followed. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for another chance to confront me. I've done research, trying to find any explanation for what happened. I've looked into the history of the hotel, searched for similar experiences, even consulted with paranormal experts, but nothing quite matches what I encountered. It's like he was something unique, something that defies categorization. The worst part is the lingering doubt, the nagging feeling that he was right, that deep down, I do know who he is. But every time I try to pursue that thought, my mind shies away, like it's protecting me from some terrible truth. I don't know if I'll ever find answers, or if I even want to. Part of me hopes that by sharing this story, someone out there might recognize it, might have experienced something similar. But another part of me is terrified of drawing attention to myself, of somehow summoning him back into my life. All I can do now is try to move forward, to rebuild my life piece by piece. But I know I'll never be the same person I was before I walked into that hotel. The encounter changed me, marked me in some fundamental way, and no matter how far I run or how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, I'll turn a corner and find him waiting for me once again. The motel was mostly empty that night, just a couple of long-term residents and one guest who had checked in earlier that afternoon. I didn't expect much activity, so I grabbed a book and prepared for a long, quiet shift. Around 11 p.m., I started hearing odd noises coming from somewhere in the building. At first, I tried to dismiss it as just the old pipes creaking or the wind rattling loose siding. But as I listened more closely, it sounded almost like whispering voices, faint and indistinct, but definitely human-sounding. I got up to investigate, following the sound down the dimly lit hallway. It seemed to be coming from room 13 at the far end. I hesitated outside the door, pressing my ear against it. The whispers were clearer now, but I still couldn't make out any words. Just an eerie, unintelligible murmuring. My hand shook slightly as I knocked on the door. "Hello? Is everything all right in there?" No response, but the whispering abruptly stopped. I used my master key to unlock the door and cautiously pushed it open, calling out again. The room was pitch black and silent. I flipped on the lights, but the room was completely empty. The bed was still made, looking untouched. Thoroughly unnerved, I quickly backed out and shut the door. As soon as it clicked closed, the whispering started up again from inside. I practically ran back to the front desk, my heart pounding. For the next hour, I tried to focus on my book, but I kept glancing nervously down the hall. Around midnight, I heard footsteps coming from that direction. I looked up to see a man walking towards me, tall and thin, dressed all in black, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. "Can I help you, sir?" I asked, my voice quavering slightly. He stopped in front of the desk and slowly raised his head. I had to stifle a gasp. His face was deathly pale, almost translucent, with dark hollows where his eyes should be. "Room 13, he said in a rasping whisper. "It's mine." Before I could respond, he seemed to dissolve into wisps of shadow that slithered away down the hall. I blinked hard, convinced I must be seeing things. When I looked again, the hallway was empty. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone to call my manager. I stammered out what had happened, fully expecting him to think I was crazy or playing some kind of prank. But his long silence on the other end of the line was somehow even more unsettling. Finally, he spoke in a grim tone. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not go near that room again tonight. Don't let anyone else go in there either. I'll be there first thing in the morning to deal with this." "Deal with what?" I asked desperately. "What's going on?" He sighed heavily. "It's a long story, but let's just say room 13 has a history. We've had incidents before. I thought it was over, but clearly I was wrong. Just stay at the desk and try to ignore anything else you might hear or see. You'll be safe as long as you don't go back there." The rest of the night was agonizingly long. The whispering continued on and off, sometimes rising to a frenzied pitch before abruptly cutting off. Several times I saw flitting shadows at the edge of my vision. The lights flickered ominously. At one point, a woman's piercing scream echoed through the building. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but forced myself to stay put, remembering my manager's warning. My every instinct was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I was too terrified to move. As dawn finally began to break, an eerie calm settled over the motel. The whispering ceased, the shadows retreated. I sat rigid at the desk, exhausted but still on high alert. My manager arrived just after sunrise, looking haggard. He went straight to room 13 without a word to me. I heard him muttering what sounded like a prayer or incantation. There was a flash of light from under the door, and then silence. When he emerged, his face was ashen. "It's contained for now," he said. "But I'm shutting down the motel. This place is cursed, and I can't risk anyone else getting hurt." He turned to me with a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry you had to experience that. Try to forget what happened here if you can. Some things in this world are better left unknown." I nodded numbly, gathering my things to leave. As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the innocuous-looking building. In the morning light, it was hard to believe the horrors I'd witnessed. But I knew I'd never forget that night, or shake the bone-deep certainty that something evil lurked behind the walls of room 13. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about shadowy figures and disembodied whispers. I've never set foot in another motel, and I avoid lonely roads at night. Some experiences change you forever, leaving scars on your very soul. That night at the Pinewood Motel opened my eyes to a dark reality I wish I could unsee. But once you glimpse what lies beyond the veil of our normal world, there's no going back. And the first day was amazing. We hiked through gorgeous canyons, marveling at the strange rock formations and colorful layers in the cliff walls. As the sun started to set, we found the perfect spot to make camp. We set up our tent, built a small fire, and cuddled up to watch the stars come out. It was magical. The next morning, we woke up early, eager to explore more. We packed some water and snacks and set off on what was supposed to be a day hike. The scenery was breathtaking, towering mesas, winding slot canyons, and an endless expanse of red rock stretching to the horizon. We were about 3 hours into our hike when disaster struck. I was climbing up a steep rocky slope when suddenly my foot slipped on some loose gravel. I felt a sickening lurch as I lost my balance and tumbled backwards down the slope. Pain exploded in my leg as I hit the ground hard. Emily rushed to my side, her face pale with worry. "Jack, are you okay?" I tried to stand up but cried out as agonizing pain shot through my right leg. Looking down, I saw my leg was bent at an unnatural angle. Oh God, it was definitely broken. Panic started to set in as the reality of our situation hit me. We were miles from our campsite, in the middle of the desert, with no cell service. And now I couldn't walk. How the hell were we going to get out of this? Emily did her best to keep me calm as she assessed the situation. She used our first aid kit to splint my leg as best she could, but it was clear I wouldn't be able to put any weight on it. We had maybe 2 liters of water left between us. In the punishing desert heat, that wouldn't last long. "We need to try to get back to camp," Emily said, her voice tight with worry. "Can you try to stand if I support you?" I gritted my teeth and nodded. With Emily's help, I managed to struggle to my feet, gasping at the pain. We started to slowly make our way back the way we'd come, with me leaning heavily on Emily and hopping on my good leg. It was slow, agonizing progress. The merciless sun beat down on us as we inched along. Every hop sent jolts of pain through my broken leg. Sweat poured down our faces, and our throats felt parched. We had to stop frequently to rest in whatever scraps of shade we could find. After a couple hours, I was utterly exhausted. My injured leg was swollen and throbbing. Emily looked just as worn out from supporting most of my weight. We'd barely covered a fraction of the distance back to camp. At this rate, there was no way we'd make it before nightfall. "We need to stop," I gasped. I can't go any further right now." Emily nodded grimly. She helped lower me to the ground in the shadow of a large boulder. We both took small sips of our dwindling water supply. The situation was looking increasingly dire. We were lost, injured, and quickly running out of water in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, the desert took on an eerie quality. The lengthening shadows seemed to creep towards us. Strange animal cries echoed in the distance. I shivered despite the lingering heat. "What are we going to do?" I asked Emily, unable to keep the fear out of my voice. She squeezed my hand. "We'll figure something out. We have to." But as night fell and the temperature plummeted, hope seemed increasingly far away. We huddled together for warmth, jumping at every odd sound in the darkness. Sleep was impossible between the cold, the pain in my leg, and the gnawing fear. Dawn brought no relief. We were both dehydrated and exhausted. My leg had swollen even more overnight and was an alarming shade of purple. Emily tried to get me to drink the last of our water, but I insisted we share it. We knew we had to keep moving or we'd die out here. But I could barely stand, let alone walk. Emily was incredible. She practically carried me as we stumbled along. But we both knew we couldn't go on much longer in this condition. The heat quickly became unbearable as the sun climbed higher. My head was pounding and I felt dizzy and nauseous. Emily didn't look much better. We were both on the verge of heat stroke. Just when I thought we couldn't go on another step, we heard the most beautiful sound, the distant thrum of a helicopter. Emily started shouting and waving frantically. I've never felt such overwhelming relief as when I saw that chopper appear over the ridge. It turned out a park ranger had noticed our car still parked at the trailhead long after we should have returned. He'd alerted search and rescue, who had been scouring the area for us. They found us just in time. The medic said we likely wouldn't have survived another day out there. I ended up needing surgery on my leg and spent weeks recovering in the hospital. But thanks to Emily's strength and the persistence of the search and rescue team, we made it out alive. I still have nightmares about being lost and helpless in that vast, unforgiving desert. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and one I'll never forget. We were incredibly lucky to survive. The whole ordeal gave me a new respect for the raw power of nature. The desert may be beautiful, but it's also deadly if you're not prepared. I'm much more cautious now when heading into the wilderness, and I'm endlessly grateful to Emily and our rescuers for saving my life out there. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong and how precious life really is.